Hey everyone, Sombre here with another national overview of a Warhammer mod nation for Dominions 5. The nation we'll be looking at today is Vampiria, the Midnight Aristocracy. And you may be thinking, Vampiria? Which Warhammer mod nation is that? I don't recognize that from the Warhammer lore. Well, that's because Vampiria is really a collection of sub-factions brought into a single nation. So in Warhammer, the most notable, the most famous set of vampires ruling over kind of undead and humans is the Vampire Counts in Sylvania, which is in the eastern part of the human empire. But there's also vampires that appear, other bloodlines, other families of vampires that appear across the world. There are the Lahmians, who are down to the southeast, I believe, and kind of moved into the mountains. There's Necrarchs, who are spread all over the world, wherever they can study and find kind of ancient lost lore of necromancy and of Nagash. There's the Strigoi, who are like more feral vampires, like Ghoul Kings, that are all over the place, and a lot of them are near where the Orcs live in the Badlands, I believe, because that's where their former empire was. And there's the Blood Dragons, who are the kind of martial, honourable, chivalric vampires, and they mostly appear where there are these martial cultures. So there are blood dragons up in Kislev, in particularly the western parts of the empire, and in Bretonia is where they like to make their lairs. So Vampiria the nation in my mod is designed so that it can represent all of these different factions, and so it's not called Sylvania or the Vampire Counts or something like that. It's just called Vampiria, kind of generic name for all of them. And it's because it's this representation of so many different sub-factions or factions that I've taken a while to make this video. I've been kind of putting it off a bit and doing some other nations first because this is quite a complex nation, probably the most complex of the mod nations that I've made. Although it's not terribly hard to play, there's a lot of decisions that you have to make kind of early on and then along the way. And I'll take you through those, and I'll cover each of the sub-factions that makes up this single nation. So the video will be quite long. Like all my other national overviews, it's not really going to be a guide on how you should play them, but just kind of an introduction to them that should get you started so you can start working out how you would want to play as them. And maybe just kind of whet your appetite for a bit of vampire blood sucking. Like the other Warhammer mod nations, Vampiria appears in the Middle Ages and is named, where are we? Down here with the other Warhammer nations. Vampiria, the Midnight Aristocracy, a nation of powerful vampires ruling over mortals and legions of undead servants. Each fort must be granted to one of 5 bloodlines, each of which has unique strengths and weaknesses. So that's kind of one of the first things that I'll be talking about is the national overview. Let's click on them and have a look at their national overview screen. So I'll begin by talking about the nation generally, their kind of features. Then I will move on to talking about the recruitables and commanders for each of the different sub-factions within them. I'll talk about the generic things that they have first, but then I'm going to talk, so it'll be generic recruits and commanders, and then the recruits and commanders that are specific to each of the sub-factions, and those will differ depending on which of those gets a capital, a fort in the capital province. So first let's talk a bit about the nation. So the race is 5 vampire bloodlines, distinct bloodlines with mortal and undead servants. Some of them have more mortal or more undead servants than others. Death and growth scales have half impact on population and income, and you actually start with Death 3 automatically in your scales. Your military is made of powerful vampires, supported by corporeal undead, ethereal spirits, and human soldiers. Magic is strong death, as you would expect, with blood, also as you would expect, and then air, fire, earth, nature, and astral. And so they've got quite a lot of magic diversity there, but it does depend on which of the bloodlines that you've got set up. Each of the bloodlines does have quite different magic, although they're mostly you do have death magic no matter where you go. Your priests are below average. Again, it depends which bloodline you have, but in general, below average. And your mechanics, well, each of your forts can be granted to a bloodline, has to be granted to a bloodline. This alters your recruitment options, and granting a capital, so your starting capital, but also if you capture anyone's capital, if you put a fort there and grant that to a bloodline, you are allowed unique recruits for that chosen bloodline. Your forts are standard, and you have no other unusual mechanics despite this, although you do have the same as the Tomb Kings, you have many recruitable undead, recruitable with gold and resources and recruitment points that don't require any gold upkeep. So you can consider that a mechanic of the nation as well. Your starting site that you always get, these are preview sites of the different bloodlines, and I actually kind of ran out of space to cover all of them here, so I'm going to have to go a bit beyond just looking at things in these sites when I show you things. But your starting site, the generic one they all get, is the Legacy of Nagash, because they're of course all descended from the original vampires created by stealing Nagash's elixir of life. The Legacy of Nagash site gives you 4 death gems per turn. So no matter what you're setting up in your capital and what bloodlines you end up setting up in various other forts, you always have that base income of 4 death gems per turn. Now the commanders and units that you can see here are just the generic commanders and units that all of the bloodlines get. And each of these sites, so we've got Carstein Fort Recruits and Capital Recruits, Blood Dragon Fort Recruits, Capital Recruits, Strigoi Fort and Capital, Necrarch Fort and Capital, Lahmian Fort and Capital, that's the 5 different bloodlines. Each of those will tell you what you get if you put up a fort in a province, and you'll get the extra capital ones on top of what you get in the any fort where you've granted it to a bloodline if it's a capital province. So let's start off by talking about these generic things that you get for all. I'll just do all the recruits and all the commanders. So firstly, you get Soulless, and this is one of your Montag style recruits, which means that when you recruit it, you get a varied result. So you might get one with the spear and shield, you might get one who has no weapons at all and has no armor, you might get one with a sword and scale armor and things like that, which is the same as if you were summoning Soulless by a raised dead or something like that, or creating Soulless through a ritual. You get a variety of different Soulless. But you can see that the gold cost of 7, you might think, well, 7, that's actually somewhat high for getting a Soulless soldier, given that you can get them free in combat a lot of the time. Well, it's not actually 7, because they have Death Recruitment. So Death Recruitment 1 here means that if you have Death 3, he will cost 3 less gold. If you have Growth 3, he costs 0 less gold, so he costs 7. Death 1, 1 less, so he costs 6, and so on. So in Death 3 scales, he costs 4 gold cost, so very cheap and requires no gold upkeep whatsoever. He has all of the normal properties of being a Soulless. He's basically just a Dominion Soulless. You should be fairly familiar with them, but just to go through the properties of these undead creatures, they are poor amphibians, so you can send them under the water. They have cold resistance, just from being dead, and poison resistance. There's no blood pumping through their veins to become, poisoned or anything like that. They are undead, of course. They are inanimate, which means that they are not affected by certain things. I believe they never heal, so you can't heal them except by a supernatural means. So as they get damaged, they'll just carry that damage over. They don't heal it themselves. They don't eat anything, of course. Except maybe snacking on some people's brains or chewing on a bit of sinew at the end of battle. They are mindless, so you will need undead leadership to move them around, and of course they'll never rout, and if you rout then they'll fall apart, all the standard mindless stuff. And they're undisciplined, being zombies. You can't really give them particularly clever orders, you just send them in a certain direction. So these are definitely line holders. They're just there to distract the enemy. They do hit pretty hard. Even though they've just got a spear, they have strength 12, so they hit hard enough. They'll sometimes hit things, but they're very inaccurate, having such bad attack skill. Their defense skill is very bad, so they get hit a lot. And of course, some of them don't have spears, some of them have no weapon at all, or a sword, and so on. So I might show you what it's like to recruit a bunch of Soulless, the kind of variety you get a little bit later. But basically, they're just kind of what you would call a chaff unit. They're there to distract the enemy and hold the line. And while they're holding the line, all your powerful mages and vampire snakes can get to work. The other branch of this basic unit tree is the Long Dead Warrior, and again, when you recruit this, you'll get one from a list. You'll get a random Long Dead Warrior from a list of Long Dead Warriors. You can even get Long Dead Hoplites. Some of them are Long Dead Warriors carrying greatswords. It's from the whole variety of human or human. I think, it's just all the human Long Dead from Dominions that you can end up getting. So there's definitely some of them that are better than others. They have the same basic things as a zombie, except that the Soulless, except that they have Spirit Sight, unlike the Soulless, and they have do not have Undisciplined, so you can give them orders, so you can have them hold and attack rear and all of those kind of things, and formations. And they are a bit more expensive, They are 6 gold costed Death 3 scales because they have Death Recruitment 2, so you get 50% off in Death 3. So again, you almost certainly will have Death 3 because you default to it, and there's lots of reasons to keep it. But they don't have the usual problem because they don't have any upkeep of when you're moving your troops outside of your favourable scales. You know, with a Turmoil Nation, where you've got Turmoil discount, you can end up paying higher upkeep suddenly and maybe not realising why. Well, you don't have to pay an upkeep on these guys ever, but that is something to consider for some of the other things that you can get. What do you use Long Dead for? Well, they're just a better quality kind of thing than the Soulless. They're not quite as tough, but they're much better at fighting. And the benefit of having Spirit Sight is very nice. But basically, oh, of course, they also have PS resistance, being skeletons, arrows, and things are less effective against them. But yeah, the main thing about Long Dead Warriors is just that they're actually able to do a bit of killing in combat, especially if you tire the enemy out and kind of wear them down. They can be very effective, and of course, you can make the most of their poison immunity and things by throwing poison all over the place. So moving on from these basic units that are cheap in terms of recruitment points, resources, and of course cheap in gold. So you can build very big armies of Long Dead and Soulless. Now we get a much more high quality unit, the Grave Guard. So the Grave Guard have various features that make them very strong, and that is why they are quite expensive, considering they still have some of the issues of, not being the toughest, although they are fairly tough, and having the disadvantages that come from being undead, like enemy priests banishing you, things like that. So the Grave Guard are somewhat like a Long Dead, but they are considerably tougher. Long Dead don't have very many hit points. Grave Guard start with 12 hit points. They have a bit of built-in natural protection. They have excellent armor, which means they end up with very high protection. Coupled with their pierce resistance means that if the enemy has a lot of piercing weapons, spears and things like that, then they can really ignore a lot of that because of high protection and pierce resistance. They have all of the other same things that a Long Dead has. You know, they are not undisciplined, but they are mindless and so on. Poor amphibians, so you can send them underwater. Their death recruitment cuts their cold cost down to 20 in death view scales, but that is 20 versus 6, so they're significantly more expensive. They also cost quite a lot of resources because of this heavier armor and their special sword. Now, again, when you bring up Graveguard, you do get a random one from an assortment of Graveguard, and I can show you which those are. But all of them have the same armor. Some of them don't have a shield. They instead have a two-handed weapon rather than the ancient sword. I believe they have, is it buckler and a halberd? I can't quite remember, but I will show you once I finish talking about the generic recruitable troops. I'll just recruit some of each so that you can see the different spreads that you can get. Now, a very notable thing about them is that they have an excellent weapon. The ancient sword, there's of course the ancient glaive as well. I believe it's a glaive or halberd. Well, I'll check in a moment. But the ancient sword is magic damage and it is very good stats. Having access to a magical weapon on a recruitable unit is fantastic, especially one that has such great stats on it and is on a pretty tough, durable and nasty unit to begin with. Your opponent is definitely going to be wanting to take specific counters to deal with the Graveguard, because unlike the Long Dead and the Soulless, these are very killer units. They can sit there and just chop things up in combat. Your only difficulty is really just going to be that they are somewhat more expensive, but I would definitely expect to use a fair bit of Graveguard, no matter what you're doing with your bloodlines later on. And maybe they're a bit too strong. I'm not sure. Well, people can feed back to me, and we can try and work out a good gold cost for them. But 20 seems like an okay starting point. Then we have two cavalry units, the Long Dead Horseman, which is you should be pretty familiar with. It's your basic Long Dead Horseman that you'll have seen in the game before. Have not terribly great equipment. So they've got a bit of protection, but not that much. Unlike the others, you don't have a variety of equipment with these. It's always just this same Long Dead Horseman. And of course, all the normal things of being Long Dead. But they're a bit more killy because the Light Lance does give a charge bonus. So their first strike with that, they can do a bit more damage than they usually would, and of course they have 2 attacks. So considering that they're only 20 gold, that's the same cost as a Graveguard, but you can set these guys to hold and attack rear and so on, or attack rear, and the extra movement and that charge bonus can make them pretty useful. 20 gold's not bad for a reliable cavalry like this, but they are very vulnerable to banish. They only have the magic resistance of 10, and of course it can very easily kill them because they have very low hit points. But if you do want some cavalry, having a group of these is definitely a good idea, and of course their resource cost and is not anywhere near as high as the Graveguard. So if your resource bottlenecks, you maybe want to go for those. And then we have, as the Graveguard is to the Long Dead Warrior, the Black Knight is to the Long Dead Horseman. It's basically a mounted Graveguard. And being mounted makes the Graveguard even nastier, which is why they're significantly more expensive. 45 gold in Death 3 scales, no upkeep as usual. Yeah, they're very hard hitting indeed. They have the Ancient Lance, which can only be used once, of course. It's just a lance and it's magic, basically, but hits very hard. So a very hard hitting magic attack is excellent to have for dealing with enemy thugs and single combatants and things that rely on invulnerability, mist form, stuff like that magic is particularly good against. They have the same very nice ancient sword. This troop does not come with a variety of armaments, unlike the Graveguard. It's always just this same standard Black Knight. But yeah, very strong. And I have to say, I think 45 gold cost is probably a bit too cheap for how good the Black Knight is, and I may have to push this up. They've already received some reductions to how good they are before, but I think I might need to push this gold cost up a little bit because cavalry, especially heavy cavalry, is just so good in Dominions, and they really are heavy cavalry. I mean, they have these excellent weapons, magic weapons with very good stats on them. They have really great defensive skill because of all of this, the weapon modifiers and things. They're pretty tough, hard to hit, and have very high protection, so they can really be a nightmare for people to deal with. So I think, yeah, almost certainly I will increase the gold cost on the Black Knight a bit. And this may be, I think Vampiria is probably one of the nations that needs more balance changes than some of the others. I think it's a little bit too strong in general, so I'm probably going to be changing several of these costs, but what I say in this video will still be true. Let's go and have a look at the different variety of things you get when you recruit these units then. I will spin up a game and show you that. Right, so I've recruited 12 different Graveguard. These are the varieties you get. There's one with a sword and shield, which is the toughest, the most survivable. There's one with an ancient polearm, which hits very hard, and a buckler, which I think is probably the best variant to get. And then the other is the ancient greatsword, which is less hard hitting but has better stats. And also, very tough unit, but I think not quite as good as the polearm. I think that's the best one because you get to use a buckler as well as having this excellent weapon. But 3 very strong variants there. Here's 20 long dead I've recruited. You can see all the different types. There are some that have no protection at all, no armor, spear and rotten shield. There's some that just have a sword and some rusty armor. You can get long dead hoplites that have the long spear and formation fighter and things. So if you get enough of these, you could form a little Arcos-Scephalian style hoplite group. There are some that have great swords, which is great. It hits hard, very useful. There are ones that have different levels of armor, like having a helmet or not having a helmet. There are ones with 2 weapons. They're a bit rarer, broadsword and an axe, but very little in the way of protection. So you can see that you can get quite a variety of different quality of troops, and you can split out the ones that you think would work well together. Like you might want to have all of the ones with the shields together or something along those lines. Then there's the soulless. So the basic soulless types are that you have one with absolutely nothing at all, which is very poor quality soulless indeed, just have his fist. There are the ones that come with a spear and a bit of armor. So still not great. And then there's the slightly better quality ones, which come with a broadsword and better armor. So you basically got 3 levels. There's ones with very little armor, ones with medium armor, ones with heavy armor. The ones with heavy armor are very slow indeed. Super slow there, you can see. And yeah, they're all otherwise pretty similar, but basically you might want to separate out these because they are really hopeless and get killed very quickly, so you just use them as a distraction. So those are your generic troops. You can see that even if you just had these generic troops, you actually have some okay options to you. You have elite infantry, you have plenty of line holders and kind of your basic infantry. You have light cavalry, and then you have your very heavy cavalry. So you can see that you could get a bit done with just these, and then your bloodlines give you stuff on top of those, but you can get quite a long way with just those. You also get generic commanders, so all of the bloodlines get these same commanders as their baseline. To start off with, we have the Vampire Bat. Vampire Bats are excellent scouts. They can fly, they've got great maneuverability, they've got all these lovely survivals, so you can send them all over the place. They're as stealthy as any other scout. They're cheap, 20 gold. There's no difference for their gold cost, depending on death scales or not. They're always just 20 gold, but they don't require any gold upkeep at all. Once you've got them, they don't cost any upkeep. So you have really, really good scouts, and you can send these all over the place and have an excellent information network. They are recruitable in Fort only. They're not recruitable anywhere, like some of the Warhammer nations have recruitable anywhere scouts, but still that's a very good scout. Then you have the White King. The White King is basically the commander version of a Graveguard, and so he is commensurately elite, well, a commander version of a Black Knight, I suppose. And I'm really happy with how the sprite turned out, and I think he looks really rad. So he's got very nice stats. He's got a bit kind of more stats and strength and abilities than a typical kind of tier 2 unsurroundable 2 commander in Warhammer. He's a bit more able to potentially be a thug or something along those lines because he has no encumbrance to begin with, being undead, and he has pretty good hit points and very nice protection to start with. So if you put some good items on him, could potentially do some thugging with them, but of course you're vulnerable to all the standard anti-undead stuff. You do come with a built-in very nice magic weapon, which you get 2 attacks with. So really, really, really nice, the White Blade. Better than most bits of equipment than typical these kind of commanders would get, these like high quality military commanders. He comes with tons of undead leadership, so he can lead around your undead legions just fine. Although you have lots of death mages to do that. He is quite expensive though, 135 gold in death 3 scales, and of course 2 recruitment points, which is typical for the more expensive military commanders, but you don't want to be hiring these guys for the purpose of just moving around small squads. They're a bit more specialized than that because of their cost. No gold upkeep though, worth bearing in mind. And again, like the Graveguard and the Black Knights, maybe slightly undercosted. Maybe I could push up his gold cost a bit, but I think currently a very good option. And you can check out his magic resistance at 16 is excellent, which makes him much less likely to just get obliterated by some magic resistance checking anti-undead thing that's flying around. Now moving on to your basic mage, the Revenant. So this is exactly the same as the Revenant that you would get from summoning up a Revenant in Dominions, except that you can buy him with gold. Exactly the same as that Revenant, he doesn't cost any upkeep whatsoever. And so having a research mage that doesn't cost any upkeep is obviously pretty exciting when you're factoring in his original cost. 75 gold is not terribly high. You don't get a very good mage for it, of course. Death 1 can't do very much. He's basically just there for researching, moving some undead around because he's got excellent undead leadership, doing a bit of forging of low-level death stuff, perhaps, casting dark knowledge, those kind of things. He's not a fantastic researcher natively because he's got inept researcher, which is unlike the Revenant that you can summon up, I believe. But yeah, I had to put that in to make him less attractive as a researcher. If you have Magic 3, he is obviously massively better as your researcher choice, and you would want to get tons of Revenants. But yeah, he's not useful for anything really except for leading some troops around and doing some research. Is he too cheap for what he does? Sorry about that. I'm not sure whether he's too cheap for what he does. Again, maybe his gold cost needs to be tweaked, or perhaps it's just too onerous to have something that requires no gold upkeep as a research mage. Perhaps he should just cost some gold upkeep. I'm going to have a think about that and solicit some more feedback on that, I think. But there's your basic mage. Moving up into your kind of combat mage that you'll be using a lot of the time, we have the Necromancer. The Necromancer does cost gold upkeep. He's 130 gold cost in Death 3 scales, so of course if you take him out of Death 3 scales, his upkeep cost will start to increase as his gold cost goes up. He is pretty reasonably costed. I wouldn't say aggressively costed. 130 gold for a Death 2 is fine. It's not really exciting. But it's fine, and of course you have to bear in mind the increased upkeep if you're invading someone's land who doesn't have Death 3, and Death 3 is not terribly popular as a scale. There's not really much else to say about him. He's a basic human, he can lead undead around for you, and of course Death level 2 is pretty great for combat. You can do plenty of spamming up lots of extra undead to help you out. You can cast Shadow Blast and things with gems. You can cast all of the good stuff that Death can cast. Death 2 is pretty solid. So we have a workhorse mage here, but of course he does cost upkeep. I would say that you are likely to be recruiting a fair number of these, even though the Revenants are this very tempting offer because of their lack of upkeep, simply because you do need to have a core of mages who are able to act as battle mages, and the necromancers can do that. But you always get the same thing. You always know exactly what you're getting. Very workman-like mage. Then there is the Master Necromancer. So the Master Necromancer is 4 recruitment points, so slow to recruit for you. He is significantly more expensive, 400 gold or 295, which is still quite expensive in Death 3 scales. Does have upkeep. Basic human stats, pretty much. He's got these elevated hit points. I think I'm actually going to reduce this. He has kind of increased his hit points a bit magically, but I think 20 is a bit too high, so I'm going to reduce those hit points. Yep, so reducing those hit points to 12, just made a note of that. But you get Death 3, which is already pretty exciting. It enables you to do quite a few different things. You can forge skull staffs and so on. So Death 3 is pretty great for climbing up the Death ladder and strong as battle magic and ritual magic goes. And then you get a random skill, so 100%, quite broad. Fire, air, astral, death, blood. So each of these opens up some new possibilities for you. Some of these are things that you don't particularly get on your other mages, even with the bloodlines selected. You definitely get plenty of death and blood, so that's not so interesting as astral, air, and fire. But you've also got a 10% random, which is a bit of an incentive to get as many of these as possible, as maybe you'll get a lucky random. It's very unlikely that you would get astral 2 or something like this, so you definitely can't count on that. But maybe sometimes you might get air 1, fire 1, and then death 3, which may be of interest to you. So when you're able, you would perhaps want to be recruiting one of these. And if we were not talking about the bloodlines next, then you would definitely be thinking, oh yeah, I'll definitely get some of these. But of course, they are going to be competing in those spots for the bloodline-specific vampires, which I'll be showing you soon. So there's your generic lineup, generic units, generic commanders. Now, let's move on to the bloodlines. So the way that the bloodlines work is that, well, I will show you right now actually how this works. So when you start a game as Vampiria, you'll get this welcoming message that tells you about the different mechanics. The first thing is that you pick a starting bloodline. Your capital starts with a site which allows recruitment of 5 different vampire bloodline commanders. When you recruit one, your capital will be granted sites that grant recruitment options specific to that bloodline. So you're basically saying, my capital belongs to this bloodline. This can have a significant impact, especially because each bloodline has commanders and troops exclusive to a capital province. Then you'll be able later on to choose more bloodlines. Each time you fully control a province with a fort and positive dominion, you have to have both, and fully control as in it's not sieged, a bloodline selector site will spawn there. This allows you to pick a bloodline for that province, for that forted province, just as you did with your capital. You get recruitment options for that bloodline, but this time you won't get any of the capital exclusive recruitment options unless the province is an enemy capital that you've taken. So if you take over an enemy capital and you select a bloodline there, then you will get the capital option. So you probably would want to select a bloodline that you did not select in your capital. So taking an enemy capital could be great news. If you lose control of a province where you've selected a bloodline, the selection will be erased and you'll be free to make it again if you take control and have positive dominion there. So sometimes if you get sieged, your fort stormed, etc., then you will lose the ability to have that particular bloodline. But if you manage to take it back, you could get that same bloodline back, or you could pick a different one. So sometimes there's kind of you might want to take advantage of the fact that you have lost one of your forts, because when you get it back, you'll be able to instate a different bloodline there and get different commanders. And then this, of course, mentions death from recruitment. Many of your recruitables discount in death scales. Remember, this dynamically alters their gold upkeep too. It will vary depending on the death scale of the province they're in, but a lot of your units just have no upkeep. So here are the bloodline selector commanders that you can buy. This is turn 1 of the game. You can see you have the Carstein bloodline, Strigoi bloodline, Necrarch bloodline, Lahmian bloodline, and Blood Dragon bloodline. Blood. Each of these is 0 gold and 0 resources, because I don't want you to have to pay to set up a bloodline, and they take 1 commander point. So you could technically put in 2 of these on the first turn, but only 1 of them will count. I believe it just takes the first one that you've put in and makes that the bloodline, and the other one's just gotten rid of. These commanders themselves don't do anything, will be removed from the game. You don't get the commander that you're looking at here. This just sets up the bloodline for you. So this is just a way of selecting a bloodline. So I'll be taking you through what each of the bloodlines get, but just for the purposes of demonstration, I'm going to go with Carstein, kind of the most common, the most well-known bloodline. I'm going to recruit that, Let's not worry about recruiting anything else. Hit end turn, and we have an unexpected event has occurred in Vampiria. The fort of this capital province has been granted to the von Carstein vampire bloodline, granting access to capital-only Carstein recruitment because, of course, it is a capital. So you get 3 magic sites, and the bloodline selector, the monster there, is killed off by that event. So the sites we get, well, we started with Legacy of Nagash. That's the one that they always get in their capital, their generic one. We now have the Legacy of Vlad von Carstein. This gives us 2 blood slaves per turn and enables the recruitment of various capital-only options for the von Carsteins. Then we have the von Carstein Mants, which gives us option. These are the non-capital-only options that we get. And you get the Sylvanian Levy, which gives you more of these non-capital-only options. So you can see that by selecting the von Carstein bloodline, you get different unit selection. Of course, you get the special things in your capital, but the only other thing that you get on top of that is that you get 2 blood slaves per turn. And each of the bloodlines has some, I believe, some very minor thing that's on top, like a little bit of extra income or something, on top of the units that it can select, but only for capitals. So going back to the nation overview screen, you can perhaps see why this is a nation that takes quite a bit of getting used to and is a bit more complex, because there's just so many different branching paths that you can go to. Well, I say branching, but so many different optional paths that you can set up that give you different access to different units and different commanders and things. So let's start off by looking at the von Carsteins. So here's Carstein Fort Recruits and Carstein Capital Recruits. These sites don't tell you about that extra 2 blood slave income that you'll get, so I will, for each of these bloodlines, I will show you the real world building of those sites so that you can see if you get any extra income or anything. But if you build in your capital as the von Carsteins, let's start with that. So if this is your starting one, or if you did it on enemy capital, here's what you get. Oh no, it does show you the slaves there. I stand corrected. So you get recruitment of the Knight Commander of the Rose. Knight Commander of the Rose is a sacred priest level 1 and a combat caster, kind of a paladin priest type unit of this religion that the von Carsteins have created. You can see that for each of these units, I will quickly show you the gold cost and death rescales. And because there's just so many units in total, I'm not going to spend a long time on each of them. I'm just going to kind of talk about their general abilities and what they might be useful for. But 130 gold cost and death rescales, 2 recruitment points because he is a priest, an inspirational leader, and this is a mortal who has decided to serve the von Carsteins, and yeah, he allows you to bless your troops. He's a pretty good leader of some mortal troops because of his inspirational, and he's not terribly expensive, so maybe you'll want to use him. He's also just kind of cool, and you maybe could do some thugging with him. Then we have the Cairn Wraith as a commander. Some of the other vampires get Cairn Wraiths as troops, but the von Carsteins get them as commanders. So Cairn Wraiths are, and I do like that sprite that I did in the end. This is, of course, see-through in the game Ethereal. It's got a little lantern. So the Cairn Wraith relies very heavily on the fact that it is ethereal to avoid damage. It has no protection, although it does have invulnerability 10 built in, so it has a basic resistance to mundane weapons. It does have a bit of protection even if they pass through the ethereality if the weapon is not magic. They are not terribly expensive in death rescales, only 60 gold. And the purpose of the Cairn Wraith is basically to lead a small number of undead and to act as a thug. That's basically what they do. They're single combatants. They have a very nasty Cairn Scythe that is armor piercing and very high damage. In fact, this is probably a bit too high damage for an armor piercing weapon. I may have to review that, like many things in this mod. And he also has a Chilling Grasp, which is armor negating cold and magic damage. So very capable of destroying single targets with that armor piercing attack and that armor negating cold attack. Very nasty. But of course, he's not terribly tough because he doesn't have the protection. If they can get through the ethereality, they can definitely destroy him. He's got pretty good magic resistance and he's got morale 30, so he's got plenty of advantages. You can use these guys as stealthy raiders because they do have stealth. And they require no gold upkeep whatsoever, so they're nice to just have them positioned to the enemy territory and maybe send them out to chop some stuff up. But if you don't give them different weapons, even though they've got fear, pretty good fear actually, even despite that, they are not going to do very much against province defense, I think. If you put Maybe a misc item to help them survive a little bit longer. They can't carry a good selection of items. You can't put black steel plate on them or something like that to make them really tough. But maybe you could do a bit of light raiding with these guys. They're kind of tricky to use, to be honest. Then we have a real centerpiece of the von Carstein Vampire Bloodline, which is their Vampire Lord. So each of the bloodlines you get in your capital set of recruits, you get a kind of a Lord version, an upgraded version of the Vampire, and then you get a lower tier version of the Vampire in any fort where you get them. So when you're picking what you're going to take for your very first one, you do want to consider these capital things specifically, and the Lord version of the Vampire is definitely something that you want to take into account. So the von Carstein Vampire Lord has an absolute panoply of abilities. He has regeneration built in, although it's not very strong, regeneration 5%. He's got very nice invulnerability built in, 15. He's got susceptibility to fire. The von Carsteins are vulnerable to fire. The von Carsteins also don't like crossing rivers. They're not able to do that, much like Dominion's vampires. They are combat casters. He's very much able to be a melee combatant. He's very strong in melee, but also has excellent magic. He is unsurroundable. He's a tier 3 commander, so unsurroundable 3. Though it doesn't say here how much they cost in Death 3, I will have to add that to the description, but let me work that out. So Death Recruitment 60 would mean in Death 3 they were minus 180 to their gold cost, so they would cost 360 gold. So pretty expensive, but considering all of the stuff that you're getting, all of these abilities, immunities, and so on, pretty good. Von Carstein vampires can fly, but they can only fly outside of battle. They turn outside of battle into a bat, fly to where they're going, and then in the battle they lose flying and just ride around on their horse. So yeah, they have that ability. Strategic movement flying, very useful. Don't have it tactically, not flying in combat. But you can see that you come with really good equipment and you have good stats, very, very tough, strong, excellent attack and defense, and so on. Of course, high morale, high leadership, undead leadership, just a really strong kind of military general style character, excellent protection, particularly against mundane attacks, an absolute nightmare to kill with mundane attacks, especially as they have regeneration. And you're sacred, so if you have a good bless, they can be an absolute terror on the battlefield. And then magically, they're also very powerful. You have Death 3, Blood 2, and then they also have air, nature, blood 100%, and then again 10%. So you can get blood 3 on a von Carstein Vampire Lord, and you can get maybe a point of nature that could be useful, or a point of air for casting certain self buffs. But it's not terribly exciting just having one air or one nature. Mainly they're going to be relying on the fact that they are blood and death casters. They can't get to Death 4. You would have to take another bloodline to get to Death 4, but you can forge up to get that. They have some cool abilities in battle. They have a built-in Baneblade, very nice, just a good magical weapon. They have Hypnotize built in. This is a von Carstein special. Pretty useful, although anything with high magic resistance is going to just ignore that, but it's pretty useful for keeping some more troops off you. They have a Vampiric Bite. So the Vampiric Bite is an armor-piercing, low damage, 0 damage, but they're so strong that, of course, it's actually doing quite a lot of armor-piercing damage, and it is life-draining you. It can add to your hit points and to your fatigue. So by having that life-drain attack, they are definitely able to sustain themselves in combat and keep themselves going, and they're already extremely tough. So is this worth 360 gold? I would say yeah, a lot of the time it definitely is worth 360 gold. They're very scary. Maybe they're a little bit undercosted for how powerful they are. They do cost 4 recruitment points, of course. Right, I've just gone and fixed that description. So now the von Carstein Vampire Lord, I'm going to say Carstein or Carstein at random basically with this video, so sorry if that gets annoying. Now the description includes that they cost 360 gold in Death 3 scales and they lose a flight in battle because that's relevant information for people. So, Von Carstein Vampire Lord, absolute centerpiece of having the Von Carstein bloodline in a capital. Very nice. You also get a Sacred Knight, the Knight of the Rose. This is a troop, not a commander, and is the troop version of the Knight Commander of the Rose. So, Knights of the Rose, kind of a typical paladin-style knightly sacred. They are 50 gold cost in Death 3 scales, which is not terribly expensive for what they are. Pretty good protection. Of course, Sacred, pretty good standard knight equipment. You've seen knightly Sacreds before. This is one of those. They're useful to be able to use when your opponent has a lot of counters to the undead, and obviously the things that are good blesses with the Von Carstein Vampire Lords and with other vampires, all vampires are sacred to the nation, work quite well with the Knight of the Rose as well, because it's a high protection mounted unit. So that's the Knight of the Rose. You also get in your capital only the Vargeist troop. So Vargeists are basically kind of feral lesser vampires. They fly in combat. They have a vampiric bite. They're able to drain life. They've got 2 claw attacks, so pretty good output. They are size 4 though, of course, being large, tough flyers. Lots of hit points. Cost 50 gold in Death Rescales, and they're not terribly durable. They've got a little bit of basic protection, no armor at all to speak of. They have invulnerability 10, so effectively against mundane troops they have protection 10, but that's not really enough to avoid them getting chopped up. So you have to be a bit careful with Vargeist. They're kind of fragile despite having good hit points and despite having some regenerative abilities. But if you can get some buffs on them, if you can get Iron Warriors, things like that on them, or Body Ethereal, some stuff to keep them protected, the fact that they've got the extra regeneration is going to be fantastic. The fact that they've got recuperation is very useful to avoid afflictions. And of course, if they stay in the fight and keep hitting things with that Vampiric Bite, which is of course 19 armor piercing damage, then they can pick up quite a bit of extra hit points and recover their fatigue, so they're very self-sustaining once they've got going. The Vargeist are available for, yes, the Von Carstein and Strigoi bloodlines. I don't think they're available for everyone else, but capital only for the Von Carstein bloodline. So moving on to the Von Carstein 2 sets, an extensive lineup of recruits, which you get in any of their forts, so not just in their capital. So in their fort, you effectively get 2 sets of units and commanders. One set is the mortal troops of Sylvania, who let's say willingly but under some duress work for the Von Carsteins, and then you get some additional undead recruits and things. So let's look at the mortals first, and then I'll go back through and look at the undead. So we've got the captain of Sylvania. He is a basic, boring, mundane commander. The crucial thing about any Sylvanian mortals, so the ones that you get, the mortal troops that you get from the Von Carstein bloodline recruitables, is that when they die, they come back in a soulless form, and that form has no gold upkeep. This one won't be able to lead mundane troops anymore because he's a zombie, but he will be able to lead around some undead troops. So basic commander, if he gets killed, comes back as a zombie commander. Everything that you've got has these death scale reductions. I'll just make sure they're on the screen, but I won't talk about each of them. So you've got the captain, we've got the Sylvanian Gameskeeper. The Gameskeeper is another mortal commander. He comes with a bit of a supply bonus, which can be useful because you've got death all over the place, although you do have reduced impact from it for keeping your mortal units fed. And he actually comes into battle with a bunch of hounds. So he comes with 4 Sylvanian hounds. They're basically war dogs that if they get killed turn into zombie war dogs. If he gets killed, he turns into his zombie form, his soulless form as well. So the Sylvanian Gameskeeper can be kind of useful. I don't think you could thug with him or anything, but it's just nice to have somebody who can move around those Sylvanian hounds, and he comes with a patrol bonus, although not very strong patrol bonus. I might want to push that up actually since he's a commander. Right, I've pushed that patrol bonus up to 5. You can't see it yet here, but trust me. The other nice thing about the Gameskeeper is that he is... Oh, no, he's not. I thought he was a stealthy commander, but he isn't. Then we have the Priest of the Oath. Priest of the Oath is a basic priest. Not very much to say about him. Yeah, he's cheap in death scales. He's part of this religion, the Oath, that the Von Carsteins have set up. It's not something that's in the tabletop. It's something that I've invented for the Dominions version. It's not in the Warhammer lore, the background lore, but I think it works quite well. Then we have the High Priest of the Oath. High Priests of the Oath have 2 Holy, so you can get up to 2 Holy here. A bit more other abilities like leading the undead around, and they have Death Mage level 1. But you're not going to be recruiting them to be mages. You're going to be recruiting them when you want to have Holy 2 for the purposes of preaching and things like that. So that is the High Priest of the Oath. Then we have the Von Carstein Vampire. This is your mainline workhorse vampire, although he's still quite expensive and quite powerful. 280 gold in Death Rescales, loses flight in battle, just like the Vampire Lord. Unlike the Lord, he is not mounted on a steed, which comes with various disadvantages. Being mounted on a steed is fantastic for being a combatant, but he is still quite a terrifying combatant. He still has the Vampiric Bite, he still has Hypnotize. He doesn't come with a special magic sword, unlike the Lord, he just has a normal sword, but he can replace that with something good. He has 2 death, 1 blood, and then randomly air, nature, blood, exactly the same randoms as the Lord. So if you, in terms of getting nature and air access, he's just as good as the Lord. He has slightly lower invulnerability. It's, well, say slightly, 10 invulnerability is significantly lower, so he's much less durable to mundane attacks. 25 protection against mundane instead of 28, like the Lord. Basically, a significant decrease over the Lord, but you can build them in any fort rather than just the capital forts, and you can build them twice as fast because they cost 2 recruitment points rather than 4. So I think very useful unit, the Von Carstein Vampire. The Von Carsteins are really the balanced. Balanced not in terms of cost, but balanced in terms of having a variety of disabilities. They're like the jack of all trades of the vampire bloodlines. I said I was going to cover the mortal troops then and cover the undead, but I'm actually just going to cover them in order. It's easier. So then we have the Sylvanian Peasant. This is a very chaffy unit. It is a slave. He is not very expensive at all. 6 gold, costing death 3 scales. If you want to have mortal chaff rather than using Solus and Long Dead, go with these guys. They can avoid the banishment spam. And when they die, remember that you also get a soulless form. All of these mortal Sylvanians, you get a soulless form when they die. So you get 2 lives out of this. So he's actually considerably tougher than he looks. The Peasant Archer is the same thing with the short bow. If you have enough fire that you can do fire arrows, this is a cheap way of getting tons of short bows. 7 gold costing death 3 scales. When he dies, turns into a zombie. I think he gets to keep the bow, but is incredibly inaccurate with it when he turns into a zombie. The Sylvanian Hound is a war dog, effectively. He's undisciplined. You would basically just chuck these at the front as a kind of a bit of a distraction. Not sure how useful the Hound is. Maybe slightly expensive given what it can do, but can run and distract the enemy, and then if it gets killed, turns into a zombie dog. Sylvanian Levy Archer is basically a better shortbow. He's not a peasant anymore. He's not undisciplined. He's still a slave, so he still has the decreased upkeep. Comes with better equipment, but it's a more expensive way of fielding short bows that you can actually give orders to rather than them being undisciplined. If he dies, turns into a zombie, of course. That's true of all of these. Then there's the Crypt Ghoul. So the Crypt Ghoul is not one of the mortal Sylvanian troops. Instead, Crypt Ghouls are, the best way of thinking of them is that they're hard-hitting light infantry. They're quite fast, high combat speed. They have 2 attacks. Their claw can do weak poison if it manages to hit something. Club and Venomous Claw, so 2 attacks from a fairly cheap unit. But they're very cowardly, bad morale. That's the problem with them. They don't eat because they eat the dead, and I believe I have given them the ability to eat dead bodies. I'm not sure if I have or not. Let me check. Yes, I have. So the Crypt Ghouls can eat dead bodies. They can eat 1 per month, and they will get 1 additional hit point when they do that. So it's not really a serious thing with them, but it does mean that they'll eat up dead bodies if you have a big army of them, and they'll get slightly tougher. What do you use the Crypt Ghouls for? Well, they are cheap. They're not upkeep free, but they do have halved upkeep because they are slaves. And they are hard hitting. They put out a lot of attacks. So if you want to just chop through lots of chaff, they're an okay thing to use, but they are very vulnerable. 15 hit points, lots of hit points, but only 4 mundane protection, and no armor, so easily damaged, and terrible morale. So if they run into or fire shield or anything like that, it's just a nightmare for them. But potentially useful. Let me know if you find a good use for them. The Sylvanian Levy crossbow is a basic crossbowman. Not much else to say about them. Of course, you get a zombie crossbowman if he dies. 11 gold cost in death 3 scales, so somewhat hard to mass these because they do cost a fair few resources, but it's nice to have access to crossbows. The Levy Spearman, standard Spearman, turns into a zombie if he dies. Levy Halberdier, standard Halberdier, turns into a zombie if he dies. Unlike a lot of Halberdiers, doesn't have any castle defense bonus, so something to bear in mind, but he is a good way of getting a hard-hitting, cheap unit. The Sylvanian House Guard is a bit more of an elite unit, so he has the slightly better stats. He has better attack skill and defense skill. His morale is a bit better, and he does come with castle defense bonus. So if you are under siege, these guys can be useful, although you've got lots of options for putting out lots of stuff that's useful when you're under siege. Remember that undead are perfectly good at defending sieges if they are not undisciplined. If they are undisciplined, then they are not great at all at defending sieges, like the zombies. But the long dead are perfectly good for defending sieges. And these guys can help, in theory, in this. They're kind of expensive, 12 gold cost for what you get here. I would consider maybe reducing their cost slightly, I think. Make them, maybe just put them down to 11 gold cost or something like that, but slightly better quality melee troops. Worth bearing in mind that when we're looking at this and going like, oh, that's not really worth 12 gold cost. Well, he does get a second life as a zombie who still has this, equipment. Not particularly good, but he does have that equipment. Then there's the Sylvanian Warden. So the Wardens, best way to think of them is elite troops, fairly hard hitting. They have an axe, but they're quite expensive. So what's the use of having them? Well, they've got forest survival and pretty good map move, and they have this patrol bonus. So if you do want to do patrolling, the Sylvanian Warden's not a terrible idea for that, although again, you have lots of other options to do patrolling with. And of course, like all of the other units, the Sylvanian units, he will turn into a zombie if he gets killed. The Fellbat is already sort of, I think it's like half dead, the Fellbat, but it won't turn into an undead form when it dies. It's just a very nasty bat that will gives you. It's kind of similar to the Vargeist in that it's a somewhat fragile, even though it's got a lot of hit points, it doesn't have very much protection, flyer that you fly over and attack rear with. They are stealthy, so you could maybe take them along on doing some raids and things with them. And they do have 2 attacks. They have the wing buff and the bite. The bite, okay, 14 damage. The wing buff, very poor attack, but it's nice to have 2 attacks nonetheless. They could manage to kill some things with that. But for a flyer that can go and attack the rear, they're not terribly expensive, 15 gold cost each, and they have halved gold upkeep. They don't have upkeep free, but they are these kind of animals that have halved gold upkeep. I think Fellbat mostly just you would get some of them to go maybe on a stealthing raiding party and to act as a kind of distraction, like attacking rear, attacking archers, something like that. Maybe they would be able to disrupt some mages casting spells, but yeah, let me know if you again find a good use for them because they're a little bit trickier to use than the more obvious units. So that's all of the any fort Carsteins and all of the capital only Carsteins. I think the capital only stuff is more kind of exciting and interesting, but in every fort having the ability to have all Carstein vampires is pretty great. And these levy are kind of, I think, a bit underrated by people. I think they're not bad. So to summarize, what do you get if you go with the Von Carsteins as your starting bloodline? You get the Lord, who gives you access to strong death, strong blood, and then a little bit of air and nature, but not very much at all. You get level 2 priests, you get a sacred heavy cavalry kind of knight unit. Your vampires are perfectly good as casters, but also absolutely terrifying combatants. They've got a lot of flexibility and abilities and strategic flexibility because they can fly. And you also have access to some annoying flyers that can go and attack the rear of the enemy lines. And you get a lot of mortal levy units, just kind of chaffy mortal basic units. So kind of a balanced mix of stuff, but the real star of the show is the particular vampires that you get, which is a common theme here that you don't really pick a bloodline in order to get the supplemental units. You pick a bloodline because you're particularly interested in the commanders. You could, in theory, do a bless strat based around having the Order of the Rose being your main sacred, but of course they're capital only. Let's move on to our second vampire bloodline, which is the Blood Dragons. So again, I'm going to look at the capital recruits and the fort recruits. So starting with the capital only stuff. Firstly, when you take this site, instead of getting +2 blood slaves like we did as an income bonus from taking the Carsteins as our capital bloodline, we get an extra 50 resources, which is pretty significant for making sure you get units out quickly at the start. And you can also enter for combat training and you get 5 experience for the stack every time you do that, and that can be useful for, in particular, for some units that the Blood Dragons have. The Blood Dragons have less different things that are restricted to just their capital only, but the things that they do have restricted to their capital are pretty great. They have a sacred troop, the Pilgrim of the Blood Grail. So rather than with the Von Carsteins you get heavy cavalry sacred, here you get a light infantry sacred. These are going to take a very different bless from the kind of bless that you would want on heavy cavalry or something like that. This is the kind of like maybe you could do a death explosion bless or something like that with this. You want a bless that is good for cheap, more massable troops, and it may also induce you to take slightly higher dominions so you can recruit more of these because they are very cheap. They're only 9 gold a piece, and they're not bad for 9 gold as a sacred. They've got pretty good morale. They're not going to be running away anytime soon. They're not got amazing combat stats, but they're not bad by any means. They've got, a bit of attack skill. They've got some defense skill. The main letdown is that they don't have the best protection and they don't hit super hard. So maybe you would want to take a bless that allows them to hit a bit harder. They also come with an affliction. It mentions down here many of them bear injuries from their years dutifully following the footsteps of a vampire, seeking greater and greater challenges. So much like the Malignese flagellants, you have a risk of these having bad afflictions that make them a lot worse. But still, 9 gold is very cheap for a sacred. You also get the Blood Knight. So the Blood Knight is one of the few vampire troops that is a troop rather than a commander. These are vampires still, but they are lesser vampires that serve the Blood Dragons. And they are 90 gold each, so quite expensive in Death 3 even. But they are extremely, extremely good at fighting and extremely tough. Super elite heavy cavalry is the best way to look at them. So they start off with amazing protection because they've got full plate mail, full helmet, and a kite shield, so extremely high protection. And then their protection against mundane attacks is even better because they have some invulnerability built in. Not very high invulnerability, but still invulnerability 5 is enough to make them, push them over the edge into being very hard to harm. So the Blood Knights have been very strong in people's games previously, and they've received a few nerfs and things. They may still need some more drawbacks, I would say, because they have very good morale, very good magic resistance. They don't really have a clear weakness. They hit very hard with their lance. Even just using their blood sword, they're still, this is basically a broadsword, but it's got added partial life drain. Partial life drain means it's nowhere near as good as actual life drain, but it means you can get some hit points and some fatigue restored when you hit things with the blood sword. They used to have an actual life drain attack, but I've taken that away. And not very many weaknesses. Their main thing is that they are expensive, and if the opponent is able to hit them with things that get past their protection, maybe they'd be hitting them with fire magic or something like that. They're not sacred, so they're much harder to get resistances on than sacred troops. So you've got this elite, expensive heavy cavalry that could end up costing you a lot if it gets blasted by enemy spells. They also, of course, cost quite a bit of upkeep if they're outside of Death 3, so they're already 90 gold, and then you have the upkeep for that in Death 3, but if you go into somebody else's lands attacking them, then their upkeep is based on their full gold cost of 120, so quite high. One of their great strengths is that they do have recuperation, which means that if you're using them for kind of expansions or early wars or things like that, they get rid of their afflictions. They don't end up getting very afflicted and becoming useless, which is great for an expensive unit. So a very strong heavy cavalry. I think they're now not so harshly balanced. Before they were just a bit too oppressive for somebody who was having to fight them. The commander that you get, the Blood Dragon, which is your upper tier Blood Dragon vampire. The Blood Dragon may still need some nerfs, to be quite honest. He comes with a flying mount, so he can fly in and out of combat. He's got a lot of the standard kind of greater vampire abilities. He's got the 5% regeneration. He's got the 15 invulnerable. And I think maybe on the greater vampires, this is something that I want to drop this invulnerability down a bit, because in a patch coming up, I will be doing a variety of balance tweaks, and maybe this is something that I want to change. He is a combat caster, so very similar to the von Carstein Lord. He's a combat caster. He's got great stats, but his stats are even better. His armament he starts with even better. He's got this fantastic full plate and everything. He's flying even in combat, which is very important. He's also an excellent leader. These are great tacticians and warlords, the Blood Dragons. He's 360 gold in Death 3 scales, but does not require a lab. Now, that's not going to matter very much for your capital, of course, but it can be relevant if your lab burns down or something like that. So this is the Blood Dragon. He has Death Magic level 2, Blood Magic level 2, and nothing else. He is, of course, sacred, being a vampire. The way to use these guys, he's very bad at research, but you wouldn't be hiring him for the research. The way to use them is that they're just kind of unstoppable single combatants, really, really strong. You can throw some items on them to make them even nastier, but even without items, if they've got the right bless, they're very hard to stop. They have excellent mobility built in. These paths are not terrible for doing some self buffs. You can certainly, with a gem, or with an item, cast Soul Vortex, which is important. You can give yourself Skeletal Body to give yourself Pierce Resistance. There's a few things you can do. They're not amazing casters by any means, but there's a few things they can do, and they can obviously mix things up. Like if you're expecting them to, if you brought in particular anti-single combatant techniques, maybe they just land in a battle, and instead of doing their usual charging in and using their combat skills, maybe they summon up some skeletons or something. So they've got a bit more flexibility through that magic. They have a hoof attack off their what's the name of their mount? It is the Winged Nightmare. The Winged Nightmare has a hoof attack, which is relatively strong, and it goes at a very high attack skill because of the high attack skill of the Blood Dragon. And then they have the Charnel Sword, which is magic. It's got pretty good stats. It's not amazing. It's like an enchanted sword kind of stats, and it has partial life drain. So they're not as good at draining life as the Von Carsteins, who have that vampiric bite. Which I have nerfed a bit. I've reduced the damage on that a bit in my notes. But still, they can do some life drain with their Channel Sword, and they do have this nice magic weapon to fight with. Only one attack on it, but it's still pretty good. So yeah, pretty scary, the Blood Dragons, and people have said that they're very scary early on. Later on, you can develop some counters and things for them, but early on, very strong. So what do you get if it's not in your capital for the Blood Dragons? Well, it's a much smaller selection than you get for the Von Carsteins. They have by far the biggest selection of troops. Lots of them are somewhat similar though. So starting out with the troops you get some nice mortal troops, 4 different mortal troops here. The first is the Man at Arms. Man at Arms is a relatively cheap, just mortal kind of infantryman. He's got fairly good stats. His protection is not bad. It's a broadsword, sword and board guy, but having a kite shield is always nice. He's got pretty good morale, and he has a castle defense bonus. So for 11 gold, these are not too bad for hiring to, hold up castle walls and things. Although, of course, as the vampires, you've always got other options for that. You'll note that they don't have death recruitment. The blood dragons are less into death scales than some of the others. So if you don't really want to go fully committing to death scales and having to push those scales out to other forts, the man at arms is a nice option for you. Then there is the Sergeant. The Sergeant is very similar to the Ulmish Zweihander. He has worse protection, for sure. The Plate Halberd is nowhere near as good as the full Plate of Ulm, but still has the Great Sword, still has cast defense bonus. For 14 gold, you get a troop with very good base statistics. 13 attack, 21 damage greatsword is very nice, and they can help hold up castle walls. So I think the Sergeant's pretty good. Just having access to high damage weapons is always nice. Then we have 2 cavalry units, and most of these have a mechanic where they become promoted. So first is the Imperial Knight Aspirant, who is very cheap, 25 gold. It's a light cavalry, but with tough armor, basically, is the way to think about it. He has broadsword and shield, so decent. Not really a charge cavalry, more designed for kind of sticking in there and fighting and taking on infantry over a longer time period, but cheap for what he does. Not the best stats or anything. A little bit of extra morale over normal, but yeah, just kind of a decent light cavalry. That is quite tough because of its protection. If they get enough experience, and they require 65, which is a lot, but if they do get to 65 experience, he will be transformed into a young Blood Knight with Home 6 100 and decreased stats and negated XP stars. Once that troop ends a turn outside of its home province, it will lose all XP, but also lose the stat decreases, so will remain just as strong. That's basically a way, mechanically, of having them be promoted into a unit that can get rid of the experience that it has and turn into effectively very similar to a Blood Knight, a little bit worse than a Blood Knight, the young ones are, but he can then get more experience stars and things. So yeah, if you keep them alive, maybe you would use these in your expansion party, although they're quite high resources. If you do manage to keep them alive, you can get some extra Blood Knights. Slightly not as good as other Blood Knights, but you still can get them. And maybe I should add the Blood Knights so that it can be seen here in this site as a preview. The Bretonnian Knight Aspirant is very similar. He also requires 65 experience to be promoted, but he's significantly better. It's stats wise and so on. He's got the same protection, but then he's got a better selection of weapons. He's got the Breton Heavy Lance, the Special Bretonnian super heavy, like charging lance attack. The Destrier Hoof is a better hoof attack that his horse has. He's got a kite shield instead of a normal shield, so just everything's a bit better. His stats are a bit better, higher morale, a bit more magic resistance. So they are more likely to manage to get the experience, but of course they cost significantly more. Not quite twice as much, but 25 gold versus 40 gold is significant. So yeah, another one that you could possibly boost up to become a Blood Knight. So overall, the Blood Dragon's very focused on having very tough single combatants, and they're a bit more focused on the mortal troops. You don't get any extra undead. Oh, actually, I've completely skipped over something there, haven't I? I've completely skipped over the 2 commanders they get, which is pretty relevant. So the first is the Death Cultist, which is a death recruitment, basic priest, priest level 1. You need to have a priest. This is how you get them, the Death Cultist. but not very good, basically. 50 gold priest 1 there. And then we have the Blood Drake, and the Blood Drake is the lesser form of the Blood Dragon, but he's not that much lesser. He's still perfectly capable of causing a lot of havoc. He's got nice built-in protection. He's got great protection versus mundane attacks. Why is his protection higher? I should actually just check this. So he has 23 and then 26 against mundane attacks. And how much did the dragon have? Oh no, that's right. Yep, I was thinking of the Blood Knight, but yeah, very high protection for the Blood Dragon and very high protection, of course, for the Blood Drake as well. Slightly less though. He still has regeneration. He still has the Blood Sword that gives him partial life drain, and he still has all of the other things that make the Blood Dragon good, except for the fact that he's just in general aspects worse. He's significantly worse as a caster. D1B1 is just not very much of a caster at all, and he has lower level of unsurroundability, fewer hit points, etc. Still has recuperation, which is very useful. Still has that very high protection. Still not much of a researcher at all. Don't get these guys to expecting good research out of them. With the Blood Dragons in your capital, you will of course just be using Revenants and Necromancers to do your spell casting. You know, the generic options available to you. But considering that they only cost 175 gold, which is not terribly high, these can be fantastic thugs. They've got everything that you would need to be a really good thug, except for the great magic, but they've still got magic they can use. I believe they can still cast a couple of buffs that would be useful to them with D1, maybe with a gem or something, but you can throw some items on them, and they're not terribly expensive. Yeah, so you don't have to compensate for too many deficiencies with them, and you can afford to lose some of them. Note that they are not sacred. I think I misspoke earlier saying that all the vampires were sacred. The lesser vampires are not sacred. If we go and look at the basic for Carstein as well, not sacred. It's only the greater vampires that are sacred. The Carstein Vampire Lord and the Blood Dragon, those are sacred. Only the most powerful vampires are. So as I started saying earlier, Blood Dragons, very strong single combatants, not very much in the way of magic, and then you get some mortal recruits who are fairly good, I think, and very thematic certainly, and they are agnostic to the death scales, which can be useful in some circumstances. So both of these vampires bloodlines make significant use of mortals and a kind of charming, aristocratic, in the case of the Blood Dragons, very honourable. But then we have the more feral side of the vampires, which is the Strigoi. So the Strigoi have, as usual, the two different sites there, one for cap recruits and one for any fort recruits. Let's have a look at the capital recruits first. So firstly, you get an income of 1 nature gem per turn, which is, worth thinking about. I would say that's a better income than the 2 blood slaves from the Carsteins or the resources and experience training that you can do with the Blood Dragons. You get a fairly decent sacred. It's again a light infantry. This is not a light infantry, unlike the Blood Pilgrims that is coming in a wretched state with afflictions and things. They're fairly kind of mediocre stats, fairly okay stats, but they do have a falchion and a short sword, which is not a bad combination for a sacred to have. 2 attacks is nice. If you can put the strength up on that, pretty good. Their stats are okay. They have bodyguard. Of course, they're sacred, and their protection, not great. Are they worth 17 gold? Well, I think you can do some stuff with them. It depends really what your bless is, but they're certainly an option. The other troop you get is the Vargeist. We've already talked about the Vargeist in the von Carstein segment, but yes, you also get them if you're the Strigoi. Then we have the Strigoi Mystic. So this is a mortal. They're not affected by death recruitment. They have Fortune Teller 15, which can be very nice to have several of these in your capital to kind of ward off some bad events. They're sacred, which is, a nice extra benefit. And it means that they work out as a researcher not too badly because they have 2 magic paths, 120 gold, priest level 1, sacred. You can have an okay bit of research there, 9 for 120. It's not the worst on a sacred researcher. Not sure how well they would compete with the Revenant, really, in terms of research. I've already increased his gold cost slightly from 75 to 85, but they do give you access to Astral 2, which is quite nice. You can get Astral Nature, which is, of course, a nice cross path. You can get Blood and Death on them. So they can be useful little mages. They're not the most exciting in the world, but the ability to get Astral 2, the ability to do communions with them is pretty great. Then we have the centerpiece, of course, your upper tier vampire is the true Strigoi. And this is another one that's an absolute combat monster, but he also has pretty great paths. So the true Strigoi really is very, very attractive option. They have more regeneration than is typical vampires. They have 10 instead of 5%. They have the usual invulnerability that the higher level vampires have. They're sacred, of course, because they're a high level vampire. A bad researcher, but who cares? You're not going to be using them for that. Unsurroundability, combat caster, all the regular stuff that you get. 360 gold cost in Death 3 scales. Full slots. They don't come with a helmet. You'll want to put a helmet on them. And they come with some okay armor, the armor of Strigos. It is magic, but you would maybe want to get better armor on them. If you kit them out, they're absolutely terrifying and destructive forces. They have the Vampiric Bite, the same as the. You can see I've put that down to -2 damage. The same as the Von Carsteins, but they have higher strength than the Von Carsteins, and they have 2 poisoned claw attacks, which are, not too bad starting off. You would maybe want to give them a weapon and replace those claws. You'll still keep the Vampiric Bite. So, in combat, the True Strigoi, absolute monster. It can buff itself up rather nicely. It has Earth 1, Nature 1, Blood 1, Death 3, so great magic to begin with. And then it can get up to Earth 2, Nature 2, or Blood 2. So very good at Death, and then these are excellent buffing paths if you manage to get 2 in Earth or Nature, which you will, of course, if you recruit a few of them. 4 recruitment points as usual for an upper tier vampire, but True Strigoi very strong. I would say that possibly a bit undercosted. We might have to see how that goes. We'll see if anyone can do well with them. People have been more going for the Blood Dragon so far, and not so much the Strigoi. Moving to the troop lineup for the Strigoi, we have a variety of horrible ghouls and beastly creatures, basically. So I'll start with the troops. These are the commanders at the top. Let's do the troops. So firstly, we have the Swamp Ghoul, very similar to the Ghoul, but they have the ability to swim across rivers, which is nice. They are very cheap at 8 gold. But yeah, very similar stats to the ghouls, not very high protection, etc. They're somewhat difficult to use, but yeah, 2 attacks, Poison Claw and Venomous Claw. The Crypt Ghoul, that's the regular Ghoul, Club and Venomous Claw. We've already looked at those. Again, cheap, so a mixture of using those and using the Swamp Ghouls is probably a good idea. Swamp Ghouls, are the Swamp Ghouls cheaper than the Crypt Ghouls? No, they're both slaves, they have the same upkeep. The Swamp Ghouls are faster though, I believe. Combat speed 16, combat speed 12, yes. So the Swamp Ghouls you may wish to use as flanking forces. Go after those archers, go after those vulnerable mages perhaps, attack rear. But yeah, both just chaffy ghoul units in Death. Of course, you definitely need Death to be using these. Then we have the Spined Crypt Ghoul, which is really just an upgraded Crypt Ghoul. Significantly more expensive, 12 instead of 8 in Death 3 scale, so an extra 50% on top. They have the Venomous Claw, I believe that's the same as the Crypt Ghouls. Yep, same, but they have higher strength, so their attacks are naturally a bit better. They have better stats in general, higher hit points, a bit better morale, although it's still bad. And a crucial thing about them is they have poison barbs, pretty strong poison barbs. Yeah, so anything who hits it with a short weapon, so short swords, clubs, etc., and bite and claw attacks, which are on a lot of very strong units, and hoofs on horses, they can hurt cavalry, will end up getting poisoned. So these can be quite good attrition units for. They'll get killed off, but they can do some decent damage to the enemy in the process. You have the Fellbat, same as the Von Carstein, so this is a good distraction flyer. You can dump that at the back lines, attacking mages and things. They are stealthy. They are not undisciplined, so they're actually pretty great patrollers, I believe. If you look at their patrol strength, 1.9 for 24 gold, 15 in Death 3 scales, and half gold upkeep. So Fellbat's excellent patrollers. And then finally, amongst the troops, we have a Super Ghoul, the Crypt Horror. So Crypt Horrors are basically ghouls that the Strigoi have fed their blood to. They are the only bloodline capable of creating Crypt Horrors because every other bloodline finds it so abhorrent to feed their blood to ghouls to make them stronger. Because they are empowered by the vampires, they are significantly bigger and stronger than ghouls. 43 hit points is very big. For a size 3, very, very tough indeed. Their protection's still not great, but they do have 10% regeneration, so if you can get some buffs on them to put their protection up, make them more survivable, they will do well. They also have poison barbs, even more so than the spike ghouls, so we get good attrition from them. But they are 40 gold each, so you're talking about an expensive unit now. You're not talking about cheap masked ghouls, but still pretty good. Their corpse eater ability is a bit stronger, so they can keep their eat 2 corpses per month. Each corpse gives 1 extra hit point. So you can get 2 extra hit points per month eating corpses, but it's not that exciting. The Strigoi themselves also eat corpses. Let me just look at the corpse eater value. I think the true Strigoi does not. Nope, true Strigoi have because they're not messed up and degenerate like the regular Strigoi. They don't eat corpses. We've already looked at the Death Cultist. This is your basic Holy One. Useful for blessing vampires. Remember, of course, that even though the upper tier vampires are sacred, this is not an example of that. Let's have a look. The Blood Dragon, for instance, even though it's sacred, it doesn't have priest level, so it can't bless itself, and that's true of all of the upper level vampires. So ignoring the Death Cultist, we then have the Strigoi and the Winged Strigoi. So these are the lesser forms of the Strigoi vampire. The lesser Strigoi is still capable of doing some buffs to itself with its Nature in Earth 1 and Death 2. It still has the excellent regeneration and a lot of the other things that you would expect, but it is too feral to put on much in the way of equipment. So you want to use the Strigoi when you're not going to be relying on equipment, when you've got strong enough buffs to kind of keep it going. In its Earth and Death. It's significantly cheaper than the true Strigoi and takes half as much time to recruit, of course. It's 245 gold, but you can see the magic is significantly worse. You've lost your slots, your stats are worse. It still has the vampiric bite, so it can still sustain itself in combat, but you have picked up lessened vulnerability, and of course you have picked up Shattered Soul. Shattered Soul means there's a 5% chance each turn of it doing something. Not what you told it to do, just doing something else, just potentially something quite bad, rampaging through the land, etc., etc. They do have Corpse Eater. They can eat 3 corpses per month, and each corpse will give them 1 extra hit point. So they can sometimes get their hit points up a bit more by running around chomping dead bodies. I would say, yeah, given the fact that you can have them in any fort, it's still a useful thing to recruit and to thug out, but it is harmed a bit by the lack of slots and having no armor built in, having to rely on its lower invulnerability to keep it safe. So harder to use, but maybe with the right buffs would be good. The Winged Strigoi is basically the same thing, but I believe, yes, worse magic. It has Death 2, Nature 1, and is missing the Earth 1 that the regular Strigoi has. But in exchange for that, it's flying. That's the important thing about it. You get the extra strategic movement of being able to fly around, and of course you can get attack rear and so on with them. So still pretty great. So that is the Strigoi lineup. You can see that you're moving much more into you definitely want to have Death 3 as much as you can wherever you're recruiting these things, and you're erring more on the side of the kind of wet, mushy undead and feral undead, the ghouls and things like that, instead of the dry, brittle, bony undead. And you have very few mortals. You've got the Strigoi Mystic and the Strigoi Warrior, but other than that, it's pretty much all just horrible undead charging around. We've looked at vampire bloodlines that are well balanced, martially powerful, and feral and physically very strong, the Strigoi, and then this is the vampire line, the Necrarch, which is physically one of the weakest, but magically and necromantically the strongest. Let's start by looking at their capital recruits. So you get an extra 1 death gem per turn on top of your 4 death gem income from your cap if you pick these at the start. You will have 5 death gem income per turn, which is quite nice. They come with recruitment of, I think, Tomb Banshee is as a commander, yes. So the Tomb Banshee is an assassin, a very nasty assassin, takes 2 recruitment points, doesn't have full slots, just 2, but you could still put the Amulet of a Skeleton or Living Water Bottle or something like that on them. So they're a very nasty assassin. They are ethereal. They have basic invulnerability of 10, not enough to keep them out of trouble really, but it can keep them alive under some circumstances. Gives them a little bit more lasting power. They have fear, which is of course nice for an assassin because if the enemy routs, then they die. They're poor amphibians. You can send them to go and assassinate and clear out underwater provinces, so it's nice to have the Tomb Banshee as a commander for that. They're stealthy, so you can have them sneaking about. Of course, they're not great for thugging out really, although they've got some hit points and things. They just don't have the slots for it, and their basic equipment's not good enough. But for 150 gold in Death 3, you get an assassin which comes with a Bane Dagger, which is quite nasty. If you do manage to decay them, that may be enough to kill an enemy, even if they manage to kill you in the assassination. But of course, it's MR negates, but a magical weapon, and Pretty accurate, 12 attacks, not too bad. And then they have the whale attack. The whale is air effect 1, so defense does nothing to avoid it. Magic resistance does work against it, but if you fail your defense, then your magic resistance, then you take a massive amount of damage and just die. So very good at assassinating things that don't have the best magic resistance. Very strong for that. And potentially you could kill off some bodyguards if there are some bodyguards with the whale attack as well. And then it also has Fear Area Effect 5 built in, so you can often use that to cause routes and things. They can actually, on the battlefield, be somewhat useful for just as fear thugs for doing some of that stuff, but you're going to have to do something to keep them alive because their invulnerability of 10 and ethereality is probably not going to be enough to keep them going, even with 20 hit points. So a very nasty assassin. Then you have the Cairn Wraith. Cairn Wraith is available. This is the commander version of the Cairn Wraith. I've already discussed this when I was talking about, I believe, the von Carsteins get the Cairn Wraith, so the Cairn Wraith commander, very nice. Obviously, I think I was going to decrease the damage on this Cairn site. They may have already done that, decrease the damage of it, but anyway, it's very high damage, magic, armor piercing, and you've got armor negating cold damage as well. But of course, you are 60 gold. It's a commander, takes 2 recruitment points, doesn't have any spells or abilities or anything, not really capable of thugging, it's just for destroying single combatants for the most part. Then we have, before I look at the Necrarch Ancient, which is of course your upper tier vampire, let's look at the Sacred Troop that you get. Each of them so far has a Sacred Troop. So far they've been okay, none of the Sacred Troops have been that exciting for, chucking a bless on, but the Harvester is the Sacred Troop. This is a sprite done by Executor, so thanks to Executor for letting me borrow that. Very nasty looking sprite. It's size 4, so it's big, you only get 1 per square, but you can fit in a size 2 unit helping it out. And it is a big, strong, fast, and very hard-hitting Sacred. It's also not terribly expensive, say 45 gold cost in Death 3, and doesn't require any upkeep at all. So you can get a few Harvesters, they're not terribly hard to assemble, not very many recruitment points, and basically no resources to get them. They are mindless. They're basically like a form of giant, scary Long Dead. So they are mindless. They have the other things that the Long Dead have. They never heal and so on. They have Spirit Sight. They have Pierce Resistance. They're very good against things that are just attacking them with spears. They're kind of fragile like a Long Dead, but whereas Long Dead has, Long Dead Cavalry or whatever, only has a handful of hit points, 5 or 6 hit points. The Harvester has significantly more. It's much tougher at 35 hit points, but it has low protection. So if you were going to take a Bless to help them out, you would have to do something about their low protection. What they are really great at is going fast using that high combat speed and hitting very hard. They've got the Scythe attack, which is doing 30 damage, so very nasty slashing attack, and then they have a Claw that does 18 as well. So a lot of offensive output from the Harvester, but quite vulnerable defensively. And not great for 45 gold. You can get a bunch of them, but yeah, you really would need a Bless specifically to keep them going, or some other way of protecting them. The magic resistance of 13 is okay, but they're still going to get hit with banishes and things sometimes. So that's the Harvester. Let's look at the Necrarch Ancient. This is your upper tier vampire. Like all the other the upper tier vampires, he is physically quite strong, but he is definitely the least powerful of them all. I'm quite happy with the sprite. He's got a tiny little familiar. It looks like a little Death of Rats type familiar within there. Necrarchs are by far the most magically powerful, though, despite the fact. So let's look at their physical abilities first. So they are not quite as tough as other vampires. They have a big susceptibility to fire that you're going to have to puzzle out to avoid them getting killed by that. They have the lower regeneration, the 5% regeneration. They do have fear built into them, which is unlike the other vampires. I believe none of the ones we've looked at so far have fear, even the Strigoi. Let's have a quick check. Yep, there's no fear. It's and I know that the others don't have fear. So the Necrarch Ancient does have that going for it. It's got pretty good fear because of its extra death magic as well. Physically, they do have a life period attack. They don't use the Vampiric Bite. They use the superior life rune, which does more damage and is magical. They have the Bone Sickle Staff that hits incredibly hard and is a magical attack, but it's only a single attack. And then their familiar also hits things with this little scythe and will raise things up as souls if you manage to kill them. That's more of a flavor thing, really. They don't have any good built-in armor. And I have lowered the invulnerability on all the upper tier vampires from 15 to 12, so they only have invulnerable 12. So their protection against mundane is not fantastic. Actually, I'm not sure why that's. Oh, it's the robes are added on, yet. So they've got a tiny bit of protection from their robes. They do have various slots, but they don't have a helm slot. They only have the crown ability, and they don't have a body slot, so you can't put armor on them. So you really can't turn Necrarch Ancients into thugs just by chucking some equipment onto them. That's not what they do. As magic casters, though, they are very scary. They have one astral built in, 4 death, which is incredibly high as a starting death value, very very high. 2 blood, and then they have 2 randoms, and their randoms are fire, air, earth, astral. So you can get astral 2. You get that on 1 and 4 of them will be astral 2, which is nice. And then fire, air, earth. So you're quite capable of getting air 2, earth 2, or fire 2 on them, which good cross pass with this other stuff. Obviously, you can get astral earth, which is nice. And the ability to have fire, you can then protect yourself from the fire damage and so on. So very, very powerful mages. The real star, of course, just being that guaranteed death magic 4 makes them very strong for doing a bunch of really powerful spells. So yeah, super powerful. Plus, they have Farcaster, and it's for all paths. So they have a 25% increase in battle for range of all evocations and all spells involving any path at all. And their ritual range is increased by 1 province for all of them. So they are good at all different types of magic, but of course, their strongest is starting with that very high death magic. So very nice. I think because they're stronger in the late game, often people will attempt to capture a second capital, and then they'll set up the second capital as giving them a Necrarch bloodline, rather than taking as their starting bloodline. So that's a bit more common. What do they get as their basic fort recruits? Well, it's very focused on the undead rather than on mortals. They get the Death Cultist. He's your H1. Of course, a commander. They get the Blood Revenant, which is really an alternate version of the basic Revenant. He's very similar, but instead of having Death 1, he has Blood 1. So 75 gold cost, doesn't require gold upkeep. If we compare him with the basic Revenant, I believe I've changed him. He's now 85 gold cost in Death 3 scales. So I think I'll put up the cost of the Blood Revenant to 85 as well, just to match those. But what this gives you basically is a good Blood Hunter that you can have off doing your blood hunting stuff. Very nice to have that. He's no better as a researcher or anything like that. Well, he is at the moment because he costs less gold, but once I increase his gold cost up to the same as the Revenant, it will be just a distinction of do you want Death 1 or Blood 1. Obviously, Blood 1 is the better combat path because you can do Summon Imps, Leech, and things like that. So, Necromancer Acolyte is a mortal who works for the Necrarchs, and he's really an alternative to the Necromancer. He's 285 gold and only 2 recruitment points. You can do 1 per turn from the fort. Comes with 2 death, so same as the Necromancer, but then additionally, very nice extra paths. So this is actually a really, really strong feature of having a Necrarch fort, is you just get access to this lovely variety of extra paths on a battle mage that you can just keep building. So we can get up to F2 here, we get up to A2 here, E2, S2. It's less likely because of the big variety of paths to get a double. You're more likely to just get 2 death and then like 1 air, 1 blood or something like that. But you can use the blood ones potentially for doing things in your blood economy. You can get a death 3 one. It's a 1 in 6 chance of getting up to death 3 from the Necromancer Acolyte. Those can be useful. And of course, there's good cross paths and things you can get. So I think in order to maximize your chances of getting good cross paths from them, you would be recruiting quite a few Necromancer Acolytes. And you don't need the capital to be a Necrarch capital in order to get Necromancer Acolytes. So then we have the Necrarch, which is the lower tier form of the Necrarch Vampire. Of course, he has the lowered invulnerability and everything else. He's a little bit less susceptible to fire. And he's still Death 3. His randoms he gets are, I believe this is the same. These two are the same as the randoms you get on the Necrarch Lord, but then he also gets 1 blood, 1 death, 1 astral extra. Yep, so you can get Astral 2 still, you can still get 2 in, these other paths, but that's kind of very similar to the Necromancer Acolytes of the Necrarchs. But Necrarchs still, very good, strong death mages. You've still got 1 in 3 of them are death 4, so you still get really good mages out of this. I think the Necrarchs are a little bit more tilted towards their having any fort rather than having a capital, but still getting the Necrarch, the ancient Necrarch, is very interesting. And it gives you access to the Tomb Banshee as an assassin too, if it's in a capital. Troops wise, you get the Crypt Ghoul, same as the Strigoi get. You get the Cairn Wraith as a troop. Now, this is much more interesting to have as a troop than as a commander, I find, because you can get several of them. They're still very expensive, 55 gold. You can get a bunch of cairn wraiths, and then of course you've got very good stuff to destroy things that have very high protection and so on. You've got that very hard hitting cairn scythe. You've got the chilling grasp armor negating attack. So very, very useful, if very fragile unit for going after and killing very tough things. So having the cairn wraith as a troop is very nice. Then we have the Tortured Spirit, which is another troop, ethereal troop. Is that definitely the troop version of the cairn wraith? It is, yes. So the Tortured Spirit has Invulnerable 5, which is very low, and Ethereality. His protection is 0, so he's very, very fragile for 30 gold. The benefit of the Tortured Spirit, he is stealthy, which I think the Cairn Wraith is also stealthy, yeah, so you can do raiding with those. So I'm trying to think why you would want the Tortured Spirit. I think having access to the Chilling Grasp is nice, but he has a claw instead of that big hard attack that the Cairn Wraith has. Yeah, I think I would always take the Cairn Wraith over the Tortured Spirit, so maybe I need to revisit their gold cost to make this more attractive. 30 gold in Death 3. I don't think it's particularly attractive for that. Yeah, not really sure that the Tortured Spirit is a good idea currently. And then we have a kind of cavalry variant of the Cairn Wraith called the Hex Wraith. So these are very expensive, 80 gold in Death 3 scales, but of course require no gold upkeep, being one of these undead. They're not mindless, they're morale 30. Oh, that's a difference between the Cairn Wraith and the Tortured Spirit as well. As the Tortured Spirit is mindless, so there's sometimes an advantage to that. But yeah, the Hex Wraith is much faster than the Cairn Wraith. He doesn't have the Chilling Grasp, instead has a kind of physical hoof attack, and he has the Hexwraith Scythe. The Hexwraith Scythe, very, very similar to the Cairn Scythe, but he's doing touch more damage with it, and it's still armor piercing. So again, I might want to revisit those damage values. But he also gets this extra fire of damnation effect whenever he hits. Doesn't have to do damage to do that, and that does a bunch of magical fire damage, which is armor piercing as well. You can negate it with magic resistance, but it is difficult, and it doesn't affect mindless undead and inanimate beings. So, best way to think of the Hex Wraith, he is harder hitting than the Cairn Wraith, and even more of a glass cannon. He has same invulnerability, same ethereality, a little bit more defense, I believe, than the Cairn Wraith. Yeah, a bit more defense than the Cairn Wraith. But the Cairn Wraith has 22 hit points. The Hex Wraith has just 10 hit points, so much more fragile but harder hitting and faster. So he's kind of a targeted version of what the Cairn Wraith is doing. So yeah, as it says, much easier to destroy, especially with magical means. They have magic resistance 14. They do have some resistances. The Cairn Wraith has magical resistance 16, so significantly tougher to destroy. Is the Hex Wraith a good thing to buy rather than the Cairn Wraith? Again, I'm not sure. I think maybe the Cairn Wraith needs a little bit of an increase in gold cost just because it's all round better than the Tortured Spirit and the Hex Wraith. But as I say, this is kind of a balancing in progress with this nation. So that's the Necrarchs. Let's move on to the final vampire bloodlines, and then I can move on to national spells. That's what I would look at next. So we have the Lahmian bloodline. Lahmian bloodline is similar to the Blood Dragons and the Von Carsteins in that it uses quite a few mortal troops, and the Lahmians themselves are very into seduction and political intrigue and stealth and things like that. So let's start off by looking at their capital-only recruits. Your sacred that you get is the Humanist Warrior. So Humanist Warriors are not terribly impressive sacred stat-wise, and they don't have particularly great equipment. Their protection is okay, their magic resistance and so on is okay. Of course, sacred, not reduced in death scales, being one of the mortal troops. They do come with a special weapon, the Mace of Reason. The Mace of Reason is basically just a mace, but it has the Bane of Heresy, which affects enemy sacreds and enemy gods, and does fatigue damage, irresistible, armor piercing, area effect 1. So you can use them to fatigue out enemy pretenders and sacreds. Only really useful against enemy expensive sacreds. They're 20 gold. So are they worth having? They're another one of these kind of mediocre sacreds that you can get going, but it's nice to have the option. So that's the Humanists. We also have, I should mention the base abilities that you get from having a Lahmian capital. So instead of getting an extra death gem, there was a death gem for the Necrarchs, The Strigoi get Nature Gem, I believe. The Blood Dragons get resources and experience training. The Carsteins get Blood Slaves. The Lahmians get 80 gold extra per turn, which is significant at the start of the game, a good boost to your economy. But it does increase sloth. So if you're going to take the Lahmians and set them up in your home base, you're going to potentially want to, you have to have a way of either dealing with that or just accepting that you're going to have very high sloth and like taking very high sloth to begin with for your scales. So they have the Cairn Wraith as a troop, and the troop version of the Cairn Wraith is more exciting, as we have said, than the commander version of the Cairn Wraith. So again, it's nice to have these, and I'm going to have to increase their gold cost a bit, I think. They also get the Hex Wraith as a troop. So capital only, they get those. Remember, the Necrarchs get the Hex Wraith and the Cairn Wraith as troops everywhere in any fort. The Lahmians, it's just in their capital you get those. And then you get the Lahmian of the first circle. This is your upper tier vampire. What is the Lahmian capable of doing? Well, it has kind of a balance between melee, subterfuge, and magical abilities. They're the strongest blood mages out of all of the vampire groups. They start off with blood magic level 3. They have death 2, which is fine. And then they have these two randoms for fire, air, astral. So they're quite capable of getting astral 2, air 2, or fire 2. That's pretty common with the Lahmians of the first circle. In terms of their combat abilities, you've got the Hypnotize that we had with the Von Carsteins. You have an additional ability to Enslave, which is very cool. It's a irresistible except by magic resistance, and it just takes the whoever you hit with that. If they fail their magic resistance roll, you just get them as a troop. Even if they're a commander, they turned into a troop rather than you charming them. So that can be potentially useful. It's kind of interesting, although they are very expensive, and you know somewhat fragile. No protection or armor or anything built in, but you can fully equip them. They can be thugged out. They have the lower amount of regeneration, 5%. They come with Ore 3, which is pretty high, and that's mostly the thing that would make them attractive. It's like doing some thugging with them, is lower morale enemy troops will have a great difficulty hitting them, and they have pretty good defense skill. If you can push up their defense skill as well, that would be useful. Invulnerability 12 as upper tier vampires. They are stealthy, unlike the other upper tier vampires, and they are very stealthy. They have a full life drain, not the vampiric bite, so the stronger version of the life drain that's arm piercing and magical. But they only come with a dagger. In terms of their subterfuge abilities, well, we've got the high stealth value. They have the seduction ability, and it doesn't show you the value, but it's a relatively high value, so you will be able to steal some enemy commanders, particularly with the Lahmian of the first circle. The Lahmians of the second circle are a bit worse at seducing. They have spy, which is useful. I mean, you wouldn't really want to use them as spies, but it's useful for seeing what you're doing as you're going around and seducing or raiding, other things like that. They have scale walls, which means they can seduce people inside of forts, which is very nice. They have the basic unsurroundability of 3, which is very common for these vampires. I believe the Necrarchs have a lower value. I'm actually just going to check that. Necrarch Ancients, yes, they don't have unsurroundability at all because they don't consider themselves combat mages. And you will note that, combat's kind of beneath them. You will note that the Lahmian of the first circle does not have combat caster, unlike the Von Carstein, Strigoi, and Blood Dragons. So they do have some disadvantages for combat against the others. 380 gold cost in Death 3 scales. Let's have a look at if you build a fort anywhere. So a bigger lineup here, and quite a few nice subterfuge things that you can get from them. So if it's not a capital, well, you get this in your capital as well, but without having a capital, you still get all of this stuff. You get the spy. He is a 60 gold spy. Very simple. We know what spies are like, but it's nice to have those for 60 gold. You get a recruitment point 1 assassin. And this is something that I think I might want to move to recruitment points 2, even though the vanilla game has recruitment point 1 assassins flying around. And this is basically one of those. I think I just want to avoid that in my mods generally. I think 1 recruitment point assassins can be kind of obnoxious. So I'm going to change that, I think. He has sailing. He's basically the assassin from the Marignon faction, Vanilla Dominions. He's got a poison dagger, he's got a crossbow. You wouldn't want to use the crossbow. Basically, you'd put some items on him, like maybe have him summoning up skeletons and assassinations to make him useful. But yeah, access to a spy and an assassin. I think maybe I'll keep the spy at recruitment points 1, but move the assassin to recruitment points 2. More mortal commanders. We have the mercenary captain. He's a very uninteresting basic leader, 40 leadership, but Yeah, there's a theme in the Lahmian troops that they're mercenaries, lots of them, and they require few resources to hire beyond their costing goals. They've reduced recruitment point costs and resource costs. Yes, the mercenary captain is just a basic leader. Then you have the noble consort. I think because the noble consorts are not mercenaries, their resource cost should be higher, so I'm going to fix that. But the noble consort is basically a mortal commander. He has very good equipment built in, golden helmet, armor, shield, etc. He has, yeah, I thought he would have some basic protection, but it doesn't seem that he does. He has unsurroundability 2 and some hit points. You wouldn't really want to thug him, but he's an 80 leader commander, and he comes with a magic weapon, which is kind of interesting. They're really more there as a theme, and maybe in a future version I'll make it so that they can be, if they earn the favour of a Lahmian vampire, they can possibly be promoted. Maybe I'll put in an event where the Lahmian vampire turns them into a lesser vampire, because the Lahmians, while they're the ones in control of their vampiric order, are all female. They do have some male vampires, they're just not as common. Then you have the humanist religion that's been set up by the Lahmians, kind of an anti-religion religion. So they come with Inquisitor. They are H1s. They cost 50 gold. You could potentially use them for some cool preaching stuff. You have the humanist high priest, who has got priest level 2 and is capable of doing some research because he has blood magic 1. And they are 130 gold. And also Inquisitors, you could do some cool preaching with them. But they also have a couple of cool abilities. They have Tax Collector, so you can bring them along with you on your raids to get extra income from that. And they also have Blood Searcher, which means when they are blood hunting, they blood hunt as a Blood Mage level 2. And so for 130 gold, you have a Blood Mage level 2. You can still put a Dowsing Rod on them, so I think a very efficient blood hunter there. So the Lahmians are very good at setting up a blood economy. You have the Tomb Banshee. We've already talked about this. An excellent assassin that you can get, and of course that's a commander. And then we have the Lahmian of the Second Circle. So this is your lesser, your lesser Lahmian. They still have a lot of the same abilities. They can still seduce. Their seduction ability is worse. Their combat abilities in general are worse, and they have worse magic. They have Death level 1, Blood level 2, and then they have these same sets of random, except they can also get a death there. So they're less likely to be Astral 2, Air 2, or Fire 2, but you can still have a reasonable chance of getting one of those up to level 2. 280 gold cost in Death 3 scales. Still have Ore, but it's a lower value. Still have Invulnerability, but it's a lower value. And still have the good slots. So you can thug out Lahmians of the Second Circle, and you can certainly go off and do some annoying assassination stuff with them. Moving on to the troops that you get, we have the Guardsmen. Guardsmen are not mercenaries, they cost more in terms of resources. They are pretty unremarkable medium infantry, basically, for 11 gold, but of course they don't need death scales in order to get reduced gold cost, so you don't have to consider that. If you've got a fort outside of your death scales, you can be recruiting Guardsmen. The Long Dead Archer, it's basically a Long Dead with a composite bow. They're 9 gold cost, so they're somewhat expensive, but massable. They don't cost very many resources or recruitment points, so you can get a ton of composite bows working for you. And then we have some mercenary units, and the crucial thing about the mercenary units is they have okay stats, slightly elevated gold cost, but then they cost basically no resources and very few recruitment points. So they're easier to mass. So we've got the mercenary maceman, the mercenary pikeman, who has formation fighter, so you can fit 4 of them into a square. And then the Mercenary Cutthroat. Mercenary Cutthroat is the most interesting out of them because it comes with stealth. You can lead them off doing stealthy things with your Lahmians. And they have the Pillager ability. And they're kind of interesting hybrid infantry. They have a composite bow. They have okay armor, protection, shield, etc. So they should be okay at fighting province defense. Maybe not that attractive at 20 gold, but you can mass them quickly. Then we have the Noble Cavalry. Noble Cavalry are basically the mortal Lahmian version of a knight. They're okay. There's not very much to say about them. Basically, if you like heavy cavalry, these are your heavy cavalry. They're kind of generic. They're 40 gold. Their stats are quite good. They have pretty good protection. They're not as good as the knights you get for the the other Warhammer factions like the Empire. They're certainly nowhere near as good as Blood Knights. They're a very poor imitation of a Blood Knight. Again, I would consider maybe putting some events in or something in the future to allow them to be promoted to vampires, but I'm not sure. I'll have to think about that. And then you get the Tortured Spirits. So Tortured Spirits, we've talked about before, 30 gold, very vulnerable, fragile, but does have this AN cold damage that it does. So that's what you get for each of the bloodlines. You will have to, I mean, this is where the complexity of the nation comes in. You have to think carefully about what you're going to take as your starting bloodline for, expansion, things like that. A lot of people have been taking the blood dragons and finding them possibly to be a bit overpowered. Then, whenever you take a fort, you have to decide which bloodline you're going to go with. You're probably going to want to diversify because you'll get access to the different paths and things. So, as your empire grows, you should hopefully end up with access to all of the bloodlines. And if you take over an enemy capital, there's an extra hard decision you want to consider. Do you want which capital line do you then want to have? Which extra one do you want? The Carstein's kind of the most balanced and have got lots of good chaff infantry. The Blood Dragons, you have exceptionally powerful commanders, but you're not so great magically. The Strigoi, obviously, again, exceptionally powerful commanders, and you have some quite interesting troops that you get access to, I would say. For the Necrarch, it's really about the magical power. Particularly, I think the Necrarch basic fort recruits is very strong because it gives you access to the Necromancer Acolytes. You would definitely want to do that in every game, more or less. And then the Lahmians, I think you maybe would want to take them first if you want to supercharge your economy and you're going with the Sloth. And they can give you access to very useful subterfuge units, assassins, seducers, and the like. Seducers can be particularly important for getting diversity. So that is all the bloodlines. This video is obviously going to end up being extremely long, but next I will move on to national spells. So I realized that before I show you the national spells, I should actually cover the heroes and multi-heroes they get. And to help me do that, because I can't add in any more of these future sites, I reached the limit there, which is obviously 10 future sites is the max you're allowed. So I've just temporarily added their heroism to this commander setup, and of course these won't be in the version that you play, but they're just here so we can have a look at them. And I've also added a couple of summons that we'll be looking at later. So let's start off with the heroes. Well, firstly, multi-hero wise, they get all of their upper tier vampires can appear as multi-heroes. They have 5 different multi-heroes, which are the upper tier vampires. Those will show up more often depending on your luck scale, as is normal for multi-heroes in Dominions. And then we, as is standard for Warhammer nations, have some heroes that will appear via event, and those are not tied to your luck scale, so it doesn't matter what your luck scale is. The first of those is the Dark Master of Drakenhof, Manfred von Carstein himself. So Manfred von Carstein, the best way to think of him is that he is a powered up Carstein Vampire Lord. He is much, much better at death magic than Carstein Vampire Lords tend to be, but he's got a bit of nature and a bit of air as well. He's got 3 blood, so very strong magical paths. He's got the same kind of abilities as them, the same kind of, invulnerability, regeneration, and so on. So he's a bit of a mix of a magic user and a combat beast. But he comes with some nice equipment too. He comes with the Staff Sickle, which is a nice one-handed weapon he uses, and the Sword of Unholy Power, which he uses in his other hand. And I believe he doesn't get any penalty for ambidexterity because I must have given him ambidexterity. Yes, I did. So he has the Sword of Unholy Power, which is very nice. It's a magical weapon. It's got good stats. It's only got a single attack, but it does extra attack on damage, life drain, a 10-point armor piercing life drain every time he manages to hurt someone with it. And that's on top of his vampiric bites that he can do, so he really can keep himself sustained by draining the life from people. As with all other von Carsteins, he loses flight in battle. He doesn't like to cross rivers. He's susceptible to fire and so on. But he is also an excellent blood searcher. I think, is that a feature of the von Carsteins? I had completely forgotten if they have that, the Vampire Lords. Yeah, they are very good blood searchers themselves because they enjoy doing it. Yeah, so he's the same as a von Carstein Vampire Lord in that sense. But he has Farcaster in death, so all of his death spells can be casted at longer range because he's particularly good at death because of his reading of Nagash's necromantic tomes, and I believe he's got one of them. Yeah, stolen various tomes. Of course, still has Combat Caster, and he also has Master Ritualist, which is represents his ability to just be excellent at casting rituals, which makes him really, really very good in terms of getting death rituals up. He acts as a level 5 in death magic for getting rituals up. You can't put a skull staff on him, of course, because he hasn't got any hand slots because he's got his built-in weapons, and he comes with the built-in armor of Templehof, which is pretty decent magical armor, but nothing that special, and it means you can't give him body armor. So kind of an upgraded Von Carstein there, and really focus on death magic. We have the other two heroes are also both Von Carsteins. In the future, I hope to add some heroes for the other bloodlines, but these are all Von Carsteins. They'll appear no matter which bloodline you select in your capital. They don't care about that. So the Von Carstein progenitor, the very first Von Carstein vampire, is Vlad Von Carstein. He is very similar in many ways to Manfred Von Carstein. He is an upgraded Von Carstein Lord. He's got very good magic. Starts off with 2 in air magic. He is an even better melee combatant. He's got a body slot free. Unlike Manfred Von Carstein, he comes with full helmet and full plate mail to start with. He has the excellent Blood Drinker sword, which is the same as the very similar to Manfred's sword. It can do life draining and so on. I really like the sprite that I did for him, but it really makes me think of Castlevania every time I see it. But yeah, this is Vlad Von Carstein, combat beast, very, very strong. I have not made him immortal, which he is in the lore in some senses, and so is Manfred, depending on whether they've got their ring that keeps them alive. But I decided that was a bit too much, so I didn't give them immortality. But yeah, a combat beast, very good magic. And then, unlike some of the others, he doesn't have some of the weaknesses. He doesn't have that vulnerability to fire. He can cross water, but he does lose flight in battle, the same as the others, because he turns into a cloud of bats in order to fly around on the strategic map. And then we have his wife, the Countess of Sylvania, Isabella von Carstein. So Isabella is not quite so strong. She is best thought of as being like a merge between a von Carstein vampire and a Lahmian. So she does have stealth. She has a bit of subterfuge ability. She has spy. She isn't a seducer. That's not a thing she does. But she does have Farcaster for blood, and she does come with 3 blood. So she's very, very strong in terms of blood magic, and that can be very useful for Farcaster in blood is nice because you can get up 3 red seconds. You can create forts at longer range and so on. So that can be very strong. And she does have awe, like the Lahmians do. So she's got that in her favour. She also has Enslave. While she doesn't go off and seduce people, she can enslave people's minds in combat. Again, loses flight in battle and has some of the other weaknesses the Von Carsteins do, but I think Isabella is very cool. Their events are separate, the events for Isabella and the events for Vlad. You don't get them as a pair, but I might put in some special things if you do get both of them turn up. Just some special things if they're in the same province, maybe something cool could happen in an event, but I haven't added that yet. So that is the Heroes and Multi-Heroes. Let's look at the national spells. You've seen that you have a lot of different units and things. It's really a huge nation because of the sub-factions inside it. And you also have a lot of national spells. So I'm going to go through those now. They're mostly in enchantment, and a lot of them I'll go through quite quickly because they're just ways of getting more of your troops, but not through gold. That's quite a common theme with them, is that you can use your death gems to make sure that you've got tons and tons of troops when you need them with the vampires, which is very thematic. And then they have one spell in blood magic. So let's actually start off by looking at the spell they have in blood magic. It is at level 4, so a little bit of research to get it. It's called Prolong the Cattle, and it is 3 blood. It costs 10 blood slaves to cast. It is identical to the base game spell Blood Fecundity, except it's blood 3 instead of blood 2 N2. And cost everything the same. The growth is +2, duration 1 month, +1 month per extra blood slave, does not stack with the Blood Fecundity spell. So the purpose of this spell is basically so that you can maintain a population by pushing a province into growth. Even if you've taken death scales on your pretender, which you are very likely to do. And you don't want to do this in a province where you're recruiting things that have the death discount, because that is, that's just a terrible idea. You're going to end up making all of your things cost more and cost more upkeep as well. Instead, you want to do it in a blood hunting province where you want to have that extra bit of growth. And the growth might likely be, if you've got Dominion there as well, you might have death 3 natively, in which case this will just take it down to death 1 basically. But it can mean that you don't lose so many of your population, which is what's Prolong the Cattle, kind of a horrible way of looking at it. So let's go to enchantment, which is chock full of national spells. As you'll see, there is an absolute ton of national spells there. Let's start off at the bottom. We have Zombie Mob. So Zombie Mob is cool. It has a range of 5 provinces. It's actually a distant way of getting a bunch of zombies, and you will get a bunch of. Basically, it's very similar to. I think this spell is. Is it Carrion Reanimation? Let me check what the spell it's very similar to is. Is it Carrion Reanimation in here? I can't recall. Anyway, basically, you raise up a bunch of unburied corpses, so you need to do it somewhere where there are a load of unburied corpses in order to get them, and you can raise up to 20 of them as soulless puppets. So for only 2 death gems and a range of 5 provinces, you can have up to 20 soulless appear of the various different types, medium, heavy, or light zombies. Can be very useful for reinforcing armies and getting more stuff quickly, and it's very cheap to cast. You can cast it with your lowliest death mages. So Zombie Mob, useful way of getting stuff at range. Then we have Skeleton Warriors. Every time I see Skeleton Warriors, I think of that old TV show. Skeleton Warriors. But you get 12 skeletons for 2 death gems. It's very similar, therefore, to Reanimation, which is 10 for 3, but lower research level. So you don't want to be using Reanimation basically for your. Although that will give you very slightly different long dead, I think. You'll get yeah, very slightly different ones, I think. But yeah, Skeleton Warriors, a bit harder to cast, a little bit more research, but much more cost effective. Just a way of getting more long dead. Level 3, we have Skeleton Cavalry, which is like Reanimation but for Long Dead Horsemen. So for 4 death gems, you get 10 of your Long Dead Horsemen. I think that's sometimes worth having if you want to build a big army for, you want to have some things to attack rear. Zombie Throng is an upgraded version of Zombie Mob. So 5 provinces, remote spell range, requires 3 death gems, but then it can raise up to 45 corpses. But it does cost D2 to cast instead of D1, so it's a little bit harder. You can't have your Revenants casting that for you. Then we have Graveguard, which is the same as the other reanimation spells except for Graveguard. You get 1 Graveguard per death gem. So if you think about it, the Graveguard are, they're about, I think they're 22 gold per Graveguard. So if you just quickly need to get some more Graveguard, this can be worth casting. But yeah, you maybe don't want to do it, especially later in the game if you're trying to save your death gems. It's not a very efficient thing to go for. Moving up the level to level 4, we have Black Knights. You get 4 Black Knights for 10 death gems. Of course, the Black Knights are quite a bit better than the Graveguard, but still that's quite expensive for Black Knights. I guess you'd be comparing it with the various kind of Banes and things that you can summon in Conjuration in the native game. We have Awaken White King. I quite like Awaken White King. So for 10 death gems, you get one of your White King commanders that we looked at earlier. Of course, they're a bit of a combat beast and they're pretty good for just leading stuff around. So I think that's not bad. If you just want to have something to just lead some troops around, you're using death gems together, you could always make a Revenant, or of course in Conjuration you've got Bane, who is obviously a good leader. It's similar to Revive Bane basically. What we're talking about there with the Awakened White King, but he's better than a Bane, I would say, as a leader and as a thug. Skeleton Warrior Regiment is similar to Reanimation again, but now we're up to 4 death gems required. You get 28 long deads, but you need a better mage to be able to cast that. So your basic necromancer is not going to be able to cast that without a booster. But yeah, if you think about it, we started off with all the way down here, Reanimation is 3 for 10, and we're now up to getting 28 for 4. So, significantly better in just making tons and tons of skeletons. Can be very useful. Level 5, we have Zombie Horde. This is the maximum level of the remote zombie raising spell. So it targets corpses in a distant province, and it It's up to 100 now, but of course you require a better mage to cast that. But that can be very useful for just getting tons and tons of zombies out of dead people. In fact, you can just trash a province with pillaging it and so on. If you just want the basic zombies, that can be very good. But if you see like a big battle between enemy armies, then you can also use this. It's worth bearing in mind with these spells that you don't get a leader for them, so you're going to need to have a leader. Unlike a lot of remote spells, I'm pretty sure I've set up the spell so that it removes the leader if he appears. Yes, you will need to have somebody there to pick up those zombies, otherwise they won't do anything. Now we're moving into the big boys. We have Create Corpse Giant. So level 5 research, 8 gems, and it takes 4 death. This is something that maybe your Necrarchs will be doing, or maybe your Von Carsteins with boosters or something, or Necromancer Lords with boosters. The Corpse Giant is a big, scary giant. He is a troop, but 8 death gems, and you get a thing with a lot of hit points and so on. I'm going to go and look at him now. So here is the Corpse Giant, and it is a graphic I'm very happy with. I took the giant graphic I've done for some of the other nations like the Orcs and things and then just zombified him. I think he looks really cool. So he is basically, the way to think about him is that he is a massive soulless, so he's got all of the things that a soulless have, except he also has fear, very useful to have something that causes fear. He's obviously way, way, way more expensive. 120 hit points, but not very much protection, so he is going to get chopped up pretty quick, but still 120 hit points, he can withstand a lot of banishes at the very least. He has a bit more magic resistance against banishes and things, and he hits incredibly hard. So he's got the wild swings, which is number of attacks 2, area of effect 2, so he can hit himself with that, he can hit friends with that, but he also can obliterate loads of stuff with that. And the wild swings, the enemy does not get to use their defense against it, so it doesn't matter, his attack skill sucks. He's also very useful in sieges. He's got a bit of extra siege bonus, so his total siege strength ends up being 11.3, which is pretty nice. Although you can make tons of soulless and they get good siege strength by that way, so you don't necessarily need to be doing it with the Corpse Giant, but he is a very stylish way of doing it. But that's interesting in this gold cost. I think this is because I had considered adding him to the Necrarchs as just a recruitable unit. Yeah, let me just check on that. Yeah, having checked on that, this is actually recruitable, even though I didn't put it in the preview site, so I will fix that. This is actually recruitable for gold, 180 gold cost in Death 3 scales. Doesn't require upkeep, of course. He's actually recruitable for the Necrarch capital site. So yeah, I've added that in so that you can see that he's available to the Necrarchs in the capital site. But that's kind of an interesting extra bonus of having a Necrarch capital site, is being able to pump out some of these Corpse Giants. Anyway, I think they're something where you may want to spend the death gems on them to destroy certain things that rely on not getting hit very hard, because the Corpse Giant can hit things very hard even if they've got really good defense. It has the Giant Stomp ability as well, which is another area effect 1, very high damage. And it does bludgeoning damage, which can be useful against certain things that have pierce and slash resistance. So that's the Corpse Giant. Back to the enchantment list. We have Skeleton Warrior Army. So this is the absolute top tier of the Skeleton Warrior spells. It's 8 death gems now, and you get 66 skeletons, and it's 4 death to cast. So if you need a lot of skeletons quickly, a very nice spell. And then there is Create Zombie Dragon, which is another big boy. It's another troop. You don't get a commander version of the Zombie Dragon. It costs 18 death gems, and it's 4 death to cast. So again, Von Carstein's Necrarch's much more likely to be casting it. Let's have a look at the zombie dragon. Here he is, a sprite so big that he actually passes off the edge of the the unit screen there, but he does work just absolutely fine in the game. I've drawn him to the style of kind of halfway between more like Asian style dragons and modern dragons, and also the old metal models, the old Games Workshop metal models really had this kind of cool S shape because they needed the white metal to be able to support its own weight. So that's why he's kind of an unusual shape, but I think I did a good job there, and he looks really cool. So what does he have? Well, he has a swarm of flies that fly around biting. It's not terribly interesting, but I believe, yes, it can do repels for you. He has an extremely strong bite attack. He has extremely strong claw attacks, 2 of those. So tons of attacks getting put out by him. He then has a tail sweep, the same as the Dominions of Vanilla Dragons. So it's defense negates, area of effect 1, and pretty high damage overall for an area of effect 1 thing. He's not quite as good at blasting areas and just annihilating them as the Corpse Giant, But of course, he has a lot of other benefits over the Corpse Giant. One of them is that he has the Plague Breath. So this is the same thing that the Undead Dragon Pretender has. Absolutely vicious. I believe it's maybe a little bit less strong because he has less strength, I think. And because he's a troop rather than a commander, you can't script him quite as cleverly. He is mindless and so on because he is basically just a soulless. But he does come with shock resistance 5, fire resistance 5, and then he's got the cold resistance and poison resistance. So if you can throw some buffs on the zombie dragon, he can be a real pain for the enemy to deal with. And he's only 18 death gems, so you actually can get quite a few of them. Of course, he can fly, but you'll need a flying leader to make the most of that, his mobility. But of course, he can fly into the enemy and attack them. He's not undisciplined, he's just mindless. He can take directions more easily. I'm just going to check whether the Corpse Giant is undisciplined, actually. Yeah, the Corpse Giant is undisciplined, like basic Soulless. So yeah, the Dragon, you can give him specific orders to go and do stuff, but the Corpse Giant will just go off on his own. So what else does the dragon have? Well, he also has fear, and it's basically the same as the Corpse Giant's fear, so very useful. In terms of his stats, he's tough, not quite as tough as the Corpse Giant in terms of hit points, but he has a lot more protection, and he also has a lot more magic resistance, so much more resistant to banishes and things like that. His stats here still suck, attack and defense skill and everything, but they don't particularly matter. So that's all of your national spells. So you can see that they're mainly just a way of getting troops without using gold on them. So you can really build some huge armies if you just throw death gems at stuff. And of course, you've got that blood spell to help you do a bit more blood hunting. So as usual, let's take a very, very quick look at what pretenders are available. I'm not going to go into which ones I think you should use, or like strategies or anything like that, but let's just have a look at the selection. So as you would expect, very death themed. Lots and lots of death themed things. A few things that are just kind of monstrous, like the Man-Eater, but basically all very, very, very death themed, and lots of things available in that area, including the Dracolish. There's that Plague Breath. Yeah, so nice selection of death themed things. You've got the Fountain of Blood and a couple of other blood themed things as well. So what scales would I suggest for the nation and what would be thematic? Let's just pick a Fountain of Blood for the moment. So it really depends on which of the vampire bloodlines you're going to use. So it's something that you'll want to kind of test out and think about quite a bit, I think. But you start at death 3. I think it is very unlikely, even with the vampire bloodlines where they've got troops that don't get a death discount, and maybe they would be kind of happy to have the extra income from growth. It's just so expensive to take that. That's 6 steps of Dominion of design points. It's just so expensive. So I would definitely just leave it at death 3. I think that given your revenants that you have as a basic access, going high magic is a good idea for that. And I think that if you're going with the Lahmians, maybe you would want to take some sloth. I'm not sure, but if you're starting with the Lahmians, certainly they do increase their sloth. So if you took high production, it would just get pushed down anyway. You're not massively in need of resources. You're not hugely resource bottlenecked, particularly because you can start to summon up troops after a while. So I don't think production is particularly interesting. Maybe you take a bit of sloth. Depends which one you're starting with. I think production is a little bit better for the blood dragons. Maybe you would want to have a bit of production to quickly get troops out and use some of their special troops a bit more. And I think you probably would want order. Order gives you the gold to offset your big losses from death. I don't think that you're going to be wanting to go like hugely in blesses and really tank your scales or anything like that. So I think order's pretty good for you. And of course it helps with blood hunting too to keep the unrest down. So this has been an absolutely mammoth video now. I don't even know how long it is, but I guess we'll see when it goes up to YouTube. But I hope it gives you kind of an introduction to Vampiria. They're a nation that clearly needs some more balanced things. I think people have been reporting the various things in them are just too strong. In terms of other nations having to really contort themselves in order to deal with Vampiria, particularly early on. Blood dragons have proven to be very good, and they've got access to such a wide range of stuff. It's quite hard to balance the nation, but balancing work will be ongoing with Vampiria, and I'd love to have some feedback from you. But it's also just important for me that people enjoy the nation. So if you have any feedback about whether you're enjoying it, what could be cool, and so on, there are quite a few things that I would still like to add because I've got this massive range of sub-factions within it that actually opens up a lot of things that I could add if I wanted to. Things like the Black Coach for the Von Carsteins. There's plenty of more heroes that I can add and probably will be adding. Maybe I'll have. Sorry about that. Maybe I'll have some uh, like a Necrarch mounted on a zombie dragon or a Carstein vampire lord. I think those are the only two that would probably be mounted on a zombie dragon at any point. But maybe for the Strigoi, I will put in the Vargeist. That would be a cool thing to turn up. Oh, no, it's not the Vargeist. We've already got Vargeist. What's it called? The Vargulf, which is like a massive version of a Vargeist. Yeah, there's a few more things that I would like to add. And so we'll see if I can get those in, and there's more tweaks to be done. But as you can see, the nation's already got a massive amount of stuff in it. So I hope that this is whet your appetite for the vampires, and I hope you've enjoyed this tremendously long video. And I will see you next time. As usual, the link to the Discord where you can find me will be in the description. The link to the mod, of course, will be in the description. Yeah, hope you keep enjoying it, and see you next time.